Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I'm Vince Siderio. That guy over there is Brian Driscoll. And we are ready to rock and roll with a new week of shows. And it is going to be a great week of shows. And we're kicking it off with our schedule breakdown. And a lot of times, what we've done in the past is we've done like one show where we talk about a quarter and then another show where we talk about a quarter and we kind of do it that way. So we're going to do it a little bit differently this time around. We're going to do the whole schedule today. But we're going to break it down kind of in different ways. So we're going to do the quarter thing like we always do. But then we're also going to rank the schedule 12 to 1.
We'll rank the quarters. So
Yes.
We'll do the quarter breakdown, then rank the quarters. Then now you're
then rank the teams within the we're gonna have some fun.
It's gonna be some fun.
That's all I gotta say. Yeah,
it's gonna be some fun, and then of course, Vince, we're gonna have some fun talking about the key storylines because we actually talked about that on Sunday. Like, what are the things that like most intriguing about this schedule? And what are the things that you look at and say, boy, I can't wait to have this conversation. I can't wait to have that conversation, and then dive into it. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm very, very, very much looking forward to that. Very much looking forward to that.
As am I. And the schedule talk is an interesting one this year because last year, a lot of the schedule talk was like the big three, and then the rest of the schedule, it mattered, but it was like, how are they going to do against the big three? That is going to determine what the season is going to be, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And while that was true, there were obviously some other issues that occurred that maybe some people saw coming, maybe some people didn't see coming, whatever the case may be. This year, it's a completely different conversation. What I'm hearing throughout the universe of people who talk about Notre Dame football, fans and media and otherwise, is that this schedule's a cakewalk. This is the easiest schedule that Notre Dame has ever had. And if they don't go 12-0, then they should just shut down the football program at Notre Dame.
There's actually not a ton of hyperbole in there until the last sentence.
Right. I know.
Seriously.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm saying. Like, people think this is a cakewalk schedule. And so I do want to talk about that first, as a whole, with the schedule, the perception of the schedule, and then kind of perception versus reality, to be honest with you, and what that looks like. And nobody's better at digging in deep into the numbers than you are.
Why, thank you, sir.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I appreciate the prop up of some of the numbers that you sent me. But this is not the schedule I think that a lot of people think that it is from an ease standpoint. Well, I like Vince, the way it's laid out, but the ease is different.
I think there's a lot of different aspects to this. And I think the layout part is very important. We're going to dive into that as part of this overview as well. But I think the biggest thing is there's a giant misconception of how good this schedule is. And it just to the point where some of the discussion about the schedule is just nuts. It's just like, I don't like, and people talk about it out of both sides of their mouth.
Oh yeah.
So like in the same breath, they'll talk about, well, how can you consider Texas A&M a big game because they went 7-6 last year? And then I'm like, well, what about Florida State? They were better than Ohio State. Yeah, but they lost a bunch of so what is it? Are you projecting forward or not?
Right.
Well, I'm going to do whatever allows me to win the argument, even if there's no consistency to my comments whatsoever. And so I think there's a lot of I don't know where it comes from. Like, I don't know if there's some, I don't know if other people are talking about it and then just other fans are jumping on board. Like, I don't listen to anybody else, so I don't know, but it's just weird.
Yeah.
Some of the takes that fans are having, and now some of them will then look at other things and like, oh, this is a brutally hard schedule. Those people that just like always say Notre Dame schedule's hard. And it's not always hard. It hasn't been hard a lot for a while. So I don't know where a lot of it comes from, but I have some theories, Vince. And I think the biggest theory for me is the fact that it's people look at the names on the helmets.
Sure.
That's really what it comes down to. So this perception that, well, there's no Ohio State on the schedule. I'm like, I hate to break it to y'all, but Florida State was a better team last year than Ohio State was last year. And I would argue that this Florida State team has a chance to be better than what last year's Ohio State team was. Now, this year's Ohio State team is really good. They're my preseason number 2 team. But last year's Ohio State team was not as good.
Sure.
Notre Dame flat out should have beat them. And Michigan smacked them in the second half of that game. And then they went out and got embarrassed in a bowl game against Missouri. So I think that's part of it. And Florida State fans still haven't bought into Florida State. Well, they can't do this and that. I'm like, well, they won 23 games the last 2 years. Like they're literally 23-4, and one of their losses was a game where like 90% of their starting lineup sat out the game.
Right, and they got it handed to them. But I mean,
right,
yeah.
and so I don't really care about that game. But I look, and then there's the two MAC teams. Like, oh, those are MAC teams. I'm like, well, one of those MAC teams is an 11-win team that went on the road and beat a Big 12 team last year, and they're returning like 16, 17 starters, right? So there's a lot of people making assumptions about things that don't have a lot to do with the teams. I literally had someone who say, well, I think Boise State's a better program than Miami of Ohio. I'm like, well, what are you referring to by program? Are you talking about the last 10, 15 years? If that's the case, then sure, Boise State's a better program. But Boise State's last win over a ranked team was 2021. Miami of Ohio has 2 in the last 2 years because they beat Northwestern 2 years ago, and then they beat Cincinnati last year on the road. So it's like, but it's Miami of Ohio. It's the MAC. MAC teams suck. And I just think there's a lot of narratives that don't actually, that, you know what it is? There's teams that say, okay, this is the name on a jersey. Right. So I'm going to make an opinion about that team with zero knowledge of that actual team. I think this team is going to suck because why? Just because reasons. And so I think when you look at it, there's this assumption that, well, last year you played Clemson and you played Ohio State. My argument is I don't think last year's Ohio State team is as good as the best team on the schedule this year. I don't think last year's Clemson team is as good as the number 2 or number 3 teams on this year's schedule, right? Well, Louisville, yeah, but they get Louisville. Louisville's also going to be pretty good this year. So you look in the numbers and you're like, this mantra of, well, this year's schedule is not nearly as hard as last year's schedule. There's zero evidence of that. There's no argumentation you can make. There's no data points you can point to make that claim other than your feelings.
Right.
Feel like Ohio State and Clemson are better than teams on this year's schedule. When in reality, like, okay, that's a feeling. There's no data to back that up because what I know is Ohio State was 11-2 last year, and Florida State went 13-1. What I know is that Louisville won 10 games last year and Clemson won 9. Right? That's what I know in the same league. And I also know that Texas A&M's head coach now is better than the one they had last year and won 17 games the last 2 years at Duke. He won more games last year at Duke, I believe, than your boy Jimbo Fisher won with the talent that you have at Texas A&M. Right? I mean, so you have to have a critical mind and stop kind of falling into this narrative of, well, because there's no Ohio State or Clemson on the schedule, that means last year's schedule is tougher. I'm like, well, that if you're talking just perception, maybe. But when you're actually talking quality of the teams, that doesn't hold water, in my opinion. Now, am I sitting here saying, Vince, this is a brutal gauntlet of a schedule? No, I'm not saying that. Matter of fact, I think it's a very manageable schedule. I think the argument you can make is this year's schedule is set up better structurally. Even though the opponents are similar, the overall record is similar, it's set up better. That I can dig on. I can dig with you on that one, right? Like, okay, last year, the way the schedule was put together was tough. I mean, you had 4 games in a row that were just going to be rough. There's no stretch like that this year. I don't know that there's 2 games in a row this year that are back-to-back that are super hard. So the schedule was set up correctly, but when you just look at the opponent, there's not a lot of difference, Vince, and the numbers back that up, which you can provide.
Well, yeah, the numbers are pretty simple, right? So the win-loss record for the 23. So is that – so you gave me the numbers. That's the win-loss record going into 23?
So last year's schedule, what last year's schedule did last season.
Okay.
Compared to what this year's schedule did last season.
Oh, okay. So okay, gotcha. So these records are all 2023 records, okay? So – the 23 win-loss record for the Notre Dame schedule was 81-69 last year. Okay, the win-loss record in 2023 for this year's schedule is 84-70. 3 games better than last year.
And one is a 540 win percentage last year's schedule, and this year's a 545. Now, listen, that's not a perfect correlation, Vince, because the teams are different.
Sure.
This year, some are not going to be as good. Some are going to be better.
Yes.
right? It's going to be a relative, wash in a lot of ways. But what it shows is anyone trying to say last year's schedule was a much tougher schedule based on the quality of the teams compared to this year, I just think that's a bad argument.
Sure.
I think that's a very bad argument. Matter of fact, last year's schedule had a worse win percentage than this year's. Now, you could make the case that maybe the best two teams on last year's schedule are better than the best two teams on this year's. But my argument is, well, who do you consider the two best teams? The ones that they lost to? Okay, well, who'd that be? Louisville and Ohio State? Well, Florida State last year was a significantly better team than Ohio State was. Will they be that way this year? That's a fair conversation to have, and we're going to get into that. But Florida State's still a top 10 to 15 preseason team. They're not bums, and that's kind of where Ohio State was last year. I mean, that's if Notre Dame would have done their business against Ohio State. Clemson was a 9-4 team last year. Louisville was a 10-win team last year. You get Louisville again. So when I look at the schedule, Vince, I just think there's a lot of, I'm looking at the name of the school and not actually evaluating the quality of the opponent. And that's where I think people miss the mark a little bit with the schedule. And this is not coming from someone trying to convince you that this is a brutal schedule. This is a significantly softer schedule than Georgia has, certainly.
Sure.
But this is like, you look at the 2021 schedule, this is a significantly more challenging schedule than that was. You talk about that year, you had Cincinnati was really good. Wisconsin, we said before 2021, Wisconsin's not going to be that good. We told everybody they're not going to be that good. Florida State wasn't very good in 2021. USC wasn't very good in 2021. North Carolina wasn't very good. We kept saying all year, you're smoke and mirrors. This team is smoke and mirrors. Brian Kelly's just getting by on talent. He's convincing everybody, woe is us, when in reality, they had the best team they had the best roster on the field for 12 games. The only problem is they didn't have the best roster on the sideline for one of those 12 games.
Meaning the coaching staff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you look at it, this is not a traditional gauntlet Notre Dame schedule, but it is a challenging schedule. And it's going to come, how hard it is going to come down to how good a couple teams are. The thing I also think about this schedule is I don't think there's as many really crappy teams on this year's schedule as there was last year's schedule. Like the bottom of last year's schedule was pretty bad. And the bottom of this year's schedule is not tough by any stretch. I just think this year's schedule, the case you could make is what I like about it is what I think the challenge is going to be is I see a lot of ascension with some teams that they're playing that are just going to be better than they were last year as well. Virginia, Stanford, some teams like that. So this is a schedule, Vince, that with Notre Dame's roster, this is why I say this needs to be an 11-1 or better team, in my opinion. Because this is a schedule that Notre Dame should dominate because of the team that they have. My point is that they're not going to dominate like all 12 opponents because there are some really good football teams. I say dominate as a whole, meaning like this should be an 11-win team. There's nobody on the schedule. Like I said, that team definitely has a better roster. I think Florida State the closest, in my opinion, as you study the rosters. But I just think this narrative of this is a cakewalk schedule and Notre Dame has, like, there's people in the chat. I think one of the guys that's made this case is no longer with us, no longer with our show. He's with us as a human being, but he's no longer with our show. Saying, well, if you don't go 12-0, that's a disaster. And I'm like, that's just, come on. Like, that's the thing where you're setting yourself up to be pissed off.
Yeah. You're setting yourself up for,
right.
misery.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but should Notre Dame control this schedule? Yes, they are. I'm not going to sit here and try to convince you all this schedule is tougher than it is. But I'm also going to push back on this narrative that this is a soft schedule. It's not a soft schedule. It's not a brutal schedule either. It's a solid schedule.
But this is the kind of schedule that I don't have a problem with Notre Dame playing because it sets them up for a postseason run.
Right.
If they have the proper roster of their own.
Right.
Right. I mean, you also have to schedule for 2024 and what 2024 presents, right? And I realize the schedule wasn't completely put together with the 12-team playoff in mind and all that because it's done so far in advance. But what I am saying is there has to be a happy medium in there somewhere as well, right? I mean, you can't just schedule, we should be playing all SEC and Big Ten schools all the time. And why are we playing MAC schools? And why are we doing this? And why are we doing that? Why are you cutting off your nose to spite your face? Like, why?
Right.
You know, do you never want to win a national championship?
I want Notre Dame to be challenged, Vince. I do.
Sure, absolutely.
But to your point, they don't need to do what they did during the Davie era either.
Right, exactly.
Where by the end of September, you had played 5 Power 5 schools. The other thing, too, is we have people in mind, Notre Dame suffered through a little bit of what happened to Georgia last year. Georgia's schedule ended up being weaker than it would have been because a game got canceled outside of their control. The SEC canceled the Oklahoma game, and they scheduled with somebody soft. Notre Dame did not cancel the Miami game. Miami and the ACC kind of did that. And then by that late because of, like you said, these schedules are done so far in advance,
right,
that it's kind of like, well, you know, now who are we going to play? And then they replaced Miami with Army. If Miami's on the schedule this year, the perception is very different, and it is a very challenging schedule. I understand that. And then, you know, Brandon made a point. He says, you know, part of the perception of it being weak is they play 2 MACs and 2 service academies. Why is Notre Dame the only team whose toughness is determined by the bottom 4 teams on the schedule, not the top?
Seriously.
Right? Like, okay, they play 2 MAC schools and 2 service academies. Okay, well, both of the MAC schools were in bowl games last year. Right? And so, yeah, the service academies aren't that good, but don't talk to me about that when you're talking, point to a schedule of teams that play FCS opponents. There's no FCS opponents on the schedule this year like there were last year. Army and Navy and both MAC schools would all pound Tennessee State.
Yes.
All of them. Right? So that's what I'm saying. Like Pitt would be one last year was worse than most teams on the schedule this year. So the whole thing about, you just look at MAC schools. Yeah, but what about those MAC schools?
Right.
Well, one of those MAC schools won 11 games last year and returns like 17 starters, Vince. So we look at 17 or 18 starters from last
18,
year.
I think you said.
So like, to me, that's the thing is that you look at and say, hey, listen, you can say MAC, but you're not actually making a point when you say MAC.
Yeah, you're not making the point you think you are.
Yeah, like don't allow that narrative to like if they're playing 2 crap MAC teams, then okay, that's a different conversation.
Sure.
Like remember 2019, they played like New Mexico and Bowling Green. They were awful. They were awful teams. That was a weak schedule in 19. You know, New Mexico was brutally bad. Bowling Green was brutally bad. And yet some other teams on your schedule, Vince, that year that just weren't very good football teams. And so you can look at that and say, yeah, that was a pretty soft schedule. You know, you look at 2021, you say, but they played a MAC school. They played Toledo, who's really good.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
they only won by a field goal, I think, if I remember correctly.
Well, they won by a point. They had to come back late. Actually, it was by 3. You're right. It wasn't a field goal. They won by 3 points. It was 32-29. They scored a touchdown at the end to win that game.
That's right. Yep.
You know, 2019, I get it. You played a New Mexico team that stunk. You played a Bowling Green team that stunk. You played a Duke team that stunk. You played a Boston College team that stunk. You played a Stanford team that stunk. I mean, we made these arguments back then. This is a soft schedule. You have 2 good teams in your you and I have talked about this for years. You know how soft the scheduling would have been. You look at 2021. You know, you played way more teams in 2021 that were bad than compared to this year because USC was down, North Carolina wasn't very good. So my point is this: we have to be able to have a middle ground on this conversation. We have to be able to look back and say, listen, this is not a brutal schedule. This is not a vintage Notre Dame schedule, partly out of their control. When you lose Miami as late as they lost Miami, there's not a lot of good options.
And when you swap them out for Army, like I get it. Like
you're at least getting something traditional there. Yeah, it's a long-time rival. It's 100 years since, you know, the big, you know, was it Notre Dame's first national title, right? Was that in 20 or 24? But you know, the point, Vince, is there's at least you're saying, okay, well, we're not going to get a good opponent, so at least we're getting somebody that's a quality storyline,
sure. And they're doing it at Yankee Stadium.
Notre Dame's first national title was in 1924.
Honestly, I give Notre Dame a lot of credit for at least scheduling a game where they can dip into the history. They can, you know, kind of
that year they played Army in the Polo Grounds that year.
Correct.
And you know, Miami, that was back when Army was, you know, pretty good program back in the day. So
right.
Look, I get it. And we're not going to sit here and try to convince you all that this is a murderer's row. And if Notre Dame goes like here's what you could see. We could be here spinning it like, this is a much tougher schedule. And if they go 10-2, it's okay. You understand. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying like this is a schedule you need to manage. But if they do manage it, put some respect on that name is my point, right? Like
Right.
show some respect to you win 11 and 12 games in the regular season this year. Like that's respect. That's a jump. That's
Yeah.
definitely a jump.
Oh,
You go
absolutely.
10-2 against the schedule this year, it's basically you are the team you should have been last year.
Right.
You should have beat one of the 3 teams you lost to last year. I mean that's it. You're better, but you're not. You haven't taken that big jump like you need to.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm not going to act like they're just going to roll the balls out and beat all 12 teams on the schedule. I think that's my issue, Vince. Is it's not that you guys this schedule's so hard, you guys are missing the boat. It's like no, this is not a murderer's row. This is not what Georgia has to play this year. I mean, you look at what Georgia has to play this year, and I'm like, good Lord, I'm glad Notre Dame doesn't have that schedule. You know, I mean that's now you're getting to the point where it's like, okay, this is just a little bit nuts. You look at what Georgia Tech has to play.
I was just going to say
Georgia
Tech.
I mean, I'm like, dude, that's not blunt.
I think they play 5 ranked teams.
Yeah. Georgia's playing Clemson on neutral field, at Kentucky, at Bama, home against Auburn, at Texas, at Ole Miss, home against Tennessee. Like that's a pretty brutal schedule. You look at Georgia Tech this year; they got to play Florida State on the neutral field, at Louisville. They got to play Notre Dame at home, Miami at home, at Georgia. Then they get NC State at home. You get North Carolina on the road. Like that's a rough schedule, especially for that team. So
and then Georgia.
While I'm not going to sit here and while I'm not going to sit here and try to tell y'all that I think this is a brutal schedule, I do think people need to be more willing to have a conversation about the actual teams and stop arguing about, well, they're a MAC team. Oh, okay, great. We've identified what conference they play, and now talk to me about the team.
Right.
We've identified that they're this, but okay, we get it. Texas A&M was 7-6 last year. Great. What are they going to be now? Because there was a team 3 years ago that went 4-8, and then the next year won 12 games, and then 2 years after that played in the national title game. That would be Washington. What happened? They stunk under Jimmy Lake in 2021. Washington was a 4-8 team, and then they hired a new coach who was a darn good football coach. And then they went out, and guess what? They got a lot better. And after going 4-8 in 2021, games where they lost to Montana, games where they lost to Colorado, who was terrible, got blown out by Washington State. Their only wins that year were over a Stanford team that was terrible. Like this is who they beat that year, that 4-8 Washington team. They beat Arkansas State, who that season, Vince, was 2-10. They beat them by, let's see, what was the win total? They beat them by 49 points. Okay, good for you. Then they beat a Cal team that went 5-7. Then they beat an Arizona team that went 1-11, and then they beat a Stanford team that went 3-9. That's who Washington beat. Washington's big win in 2021 was over a 5-7 Cal team. The next year, with a new coach, same team, some transfers came in, new coach, they went 11-2. Their losses were an 8-point loss at UCLA and a 7-point loss at Arizona State. They beat Michigan State. They blew out Stanford. They beat Arizona by double digits. They beat Oregon State. They went on the road and beat Oregon. They beat Washington State on the road, blew them out, and then they beat Texas in a bowl game. Then the next season, of course, as we all know, that team went 14-1 and played for the national championship. So, like, just looking at last year only tells you so much. Just like I'm not trying to convince you all that this is 13-1, should have been in the college football playoff, Florida State. We don't know that they're that team. I don't think that they're that team. I definitely think they're top 10 to 15 team, though, which we'll get into. So that's all I'm trying to get across as we kick this off, Vince, is there needs to be more respect for the schedule. So there's a greater appreciation for if Notre Dame is really good, but not an overhyping of the schedule to where we then accept 9-3, 10-2 because, they just had to play, X number of road games or something. They played too many night games. Oh, okay, well, so freaking what?
Right.
Like go get the job done. You're Notre Dame. So that's really where I wanted to make sure that we landed that initial plane, Vince, is like, listen, this isn't we're not trying to convince you guys that this is a schedule that should make you perfectly fine with 10-2.
Right.
But you also need to appreciate kind of what this team would be if they are able to do what we all think they should do, which is win 11, 12 games.
Correct.
That's where we're at.
Now, I think I said this earlier. I think this is a nice happy medium, to be honest with you. It's hard enough. It's not super easy. It's right down Main Street for me, which I like, frankly. Now, you always want, as a fan, you always want, maybe another marquee game or something. I get that. I get that. And I start to feel the same way when I'm going to games, like a home game. I want it to be a marquee game. Of course you do. I love watching.
I'd rather have like Northwestern on the schedule than Northern Illinois.
Absolutely.
Right. I would have rather had Vanderbilt on the schedule than Army. I get that argument, Vince. Correct.
100%.
Like I'm not going to sit there and say, well, Notre Dame needs to water down their schedule so they can make the playoff. Like, I don't believe in that, because it's the same argument I made, and that's not what you're saying. It's the same argument, Vince, I made when I was ripping into Colin Cowherd. So you just want to get rid of all the tough games so you can get in the playoff. Well, but did that schedule that you cakewalked through to get to the playoff actually prepare you to do damage when you get to the playoff?
Exactly.
That's the question.
Exactly.
And so I think Notre Dame should challenge themselves. And I believe a schedule that has road games against USC and Texas A&M and a home game against Florida State is certainly challenging yourself.
Right.
And like I said, there's some other games where you're like, you could argue that the middle of the schedule could be tougher. And that's where I think the reason I don't think it's a tougher schedule is because I think there's a big drop off after the top four.
Right.
In my opinion, like that's where I would say, if you want to critique, and this is what we can kind of maybe do, Vince, is critique the schedule. What are our beefs with the schedule?
Right.
I think that's it. There's a big drop off after the top four.
Right.
The top four teams
Agreed.
are pretty much not consensus top 25 teams, but most people have all four of those in the top 25. At least one preseason magazine has all four of them in the top 25.
Okay.
Right. So that's good. That's a third of your schedule is a top 25 team. But the team that you and I both have number 5, we think might actually have a losing record this year, because it's not the ranking of the best teams. We'll get into it. It's the ranking of the toughest games.
Right.
So when you look at it, you get past that 4, there's a big drop off. And that's where I think that they could have maybe ramped things up a little bit. Everybody's bottom 4 sucks. Right? The difference between it is, okay, how good is your top and then how good is your middle? That's what tells you how good a schedule. And that's like my thing with Georgia. When you look at Georgia's schedule, Vince, it's, the top is really heavy. I mean, you've got Clemson. Your top 3 opponents are Clemson on the road, at Texas, and at Ole Miss. That's rough. Or, excuse me, at Alabama. Let's just say top 4, because it's hard to pick. So Clemson at home or neutral field, at Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss. That's brutal.
Yeah.
That's brutal. But look at the middle. Tennessee at home, at Kentucky, home against Auburn, and then maybe Georgia Tech or Florida on a neutral field. Maybe it's Mississippi State. Like, the middle's brutal.
Yeah.
Like, you could win those top 4 and then just slip up one week because you're just worn out, and all of a sudden, boom, you get beat by some team. You get beat by Kentucky.
Right.
Something like that. And now that's a brutal schedule. Like, Notre Dame's not in that stratosphere right now, schedule-wise.
Right.
And I think it's that middle, Vince, to me, that I have the big issue. And that's like when we were ranking our opponents, it's like that's where you look at it and you're like, okay, this is where it could have been better.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Where they could have had a tougher schedule is like, maybe instead of, but then again, it's like you take one of the teams from the bottom, maybe the Army game could have been somebody better. But like, who would that have been once Miami canceled?
That's the issue.
Who was available that was really going to move the needle for your schedule once Miami canceled?
Like I said, I thought they did a good job of at least finding a game where you can publicize it, you can dig into the history, you can, it may not be the best opponent out there, but at least it means something to Notre Dame. That's not an easy thing to always do either. And they kind of did it last minute. I mean, quote unquote last minute, right? I mean, it's last minute as far as building a Power 5 football schedule is last minute, right? And so I give them credit for at least coming up with that, because they could have dipped again down into the FCS level and done another game like that and tried to make that, put lipstick on a pig there, which I still hated that they did that last year. But they could have easily done that. Would have been the easy way out, to be perfectly honest with you. That would have been the easy way out, and they didn't take that route. So I at least appreciate that part of it. They were given, some lemons made lemonade or whatever stupid cliche you want to use.
Yeah.
So I really don't have
I also strongly disagree with the notion of they shouldn't play 2 service academies. I'm like, this is something Notre Dame has done if you're someone who's like, oh, tradition at Notre Dame is you play tough schedules. Okay, well, what's also tradition at Notre Dame is you almost always play 2 service academies for most of their tenure. The last time Notre Dame won a national title, they played sometimes 3. The last time Notre Dame won a national title, they played Navy and Air Force in back-to-back games. Like, that's the thing is, like, people forget that. Some people think, like, the 1988 schedule was just gauntlet week after week after week. I'm like, no, that schedule had some weak spots, too. They played Rice that year, for Pete's sake.
They did.
They played Navy and Army. They played a Stanford team that wasn't very good. They played a Purdue team that wasn't very good. Penn State was down that year. So, yeah, it was a much tougher schedule at the top. The point is like, I don't have a problem playing 2 service academies. Well, I don't care what other people do. Other people don't have a history of playing the service academies like Notre Dame does. So it's not that this is my whole thing. If your standard for critiquing this schedule is what's at the bottom, I think you're missing the boat. If you want to critique the schedule, that's fine. Look at how the ACC hurts the schedule. Yeah, because of you took Miami out and you've got Georgia Tech and you've got Virginia and you've got you don't have Clemson, you don't have Miami on it like that. Critique that. That's where the criticism is. I have no problem playing 2 service academies. How is playing 2 service academies any different than Georgia playing Tennessee Tech and UMass? Because here's the thing.
Right.
The last 2 teams on our schedule for Notre Dame would smash both of those teams. Like, would smash both of those teams. Like, it's not even close, in my opinion, in those games. So that's my whole thing, Vince, is, I probably shouldn't say that because I think UMass actually beat Army last year, but UMass would have to be is not even the worst team on their schedule. And Correct. So, my point is this, Vince, I can't look at this and say, well, I have a problem with the 2 service academies, when in reality, every team that we're going to sit here and tell you has a brutal schedule has 2 games as bad or probably worse than the one that they play. And that's why I say, like, critiquing them because of of that just misses the mark.
Right.
I mean, Alabama plays Western Kentucky, South Florida, and Mercer this season. So, how's that worse than playing the service academies? I mean, LSU plays Nicholls State this year in South Alabama, right? Like how's that way worse than playing the service academy? So everybody has those games. You don't judge a schedule by what and literally on my top 12, they are literally the bottom 2 teams on my schedule, the 2 service academies. But why do they get special recognition for being teams you shouldn't play? Like that's what I don't get it from Notre Dame fans. Like, well, we shouldn't play both service academies. Why? How's that any different than the bottom 2 that everybody else plays? So that's where I come from. And look, my Army went 6-6 last year. Navy was 1 game away from being a bowl team last year. So that's my thing is I just think that we're for some reason we're focused on these odd parts of the schedule that don't really define the schedule and aren't different than what anybody else in college football is doing next year. That's the part that doesn't make sense to me, Vince. It doesn't really make sense to me.
Sure.
To be honest with you.
So do we want to talk about the layout of the schedule in this segment, or do we want to kind of save that for when we're talking quarters?
Let's do it in the court because this segment went a little bit long.
Yeah, that's why I was asking.
Let's talk about it in the layout. We'll kind of intro it as we get into the quarter breakdown. So let's go and wrap this part up, folks. Before we get to the quarters breakdown, do us a favor, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review, and of course, as always, sign up for the message board at boards.ourbreakdown.com. I just saw during the show, I got an email notification that somebody just signed up for an annual membership. So even during the show today, we're getting people signing up. So you do not want to miss out on that.
All right. So we are going to jump into one of my favorite parts of the year. It used to be my favorite shows, plural, but we are combining it into one show, one segment this year, and it's our quarters breakdown. And so what we decided to do is obviously every year there are 12 regular season games. It's a beautiful number because you can divide it by 4, which leaves you 4 3-game chunks, right? And as coaches, we talk about that kind of stuff all the time. Okay, first quarter of the season, guys, we got to, this is what we got to do. Hey, we're into the second quarter, this is where you need to be, things of that nature, right? And so It just breaks down beautifully in that manner. And so that's what we do because we used to be coaches. And so we're going to break it down. We got to see when you're coaches, you got to break things down small so we can understand it and we can move forward. But anyway,
you speak for yourself.
I'm just joking around, man. I just wanted to see if you were paying attention. All right.
I'm always paying attention. Come on, man. What you trying to do with me right now?
So we are going to break the schedule down into 4 quarters, 4 3-game segments. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at each segment and we are going to kind of, okay, is there a trap game in here? What's the biggest game of the quarter? What's the toughest opponent in the corner?
Overall feel
and then
for those,
once we go through all 4, we're going to decide, okay, what is the toughest quarter of the season? So yeah, that's our quarters breakdown. So
when you look at the schedule, Vince, I think when you break it down into quarters, there's kind of two ways that I like to look at a schedule. Number one is by quarters, and you can kind of segment it like we're going to do. And then the other part is you look for stretches because sometimes there may be a stretch. Like you may look at all 4 quarters and be like, there's no one quarter that's bad or hard. But then you look at it and you're like, yeah, but the last game of the one quarter and the first game of the next quarter are 2 brutal games. You play at Georgia at the end of quarter 2 and you play at Alabama in the beginning quarter 3. You may say, hey, well, look, none of these quarters have more than one tough opponent on it. But then, you have that. So you have to look at that because part of putting a good schedule together is, number one, you need to challenge yourself.
Yep.
In my opinion, you need to challenge yourself. Is Notre Dame challenging themselves this season? Well, yeah, you play Florida State. You play at Texas A&M. That's how you kick the season off. While a lot of other teams are playing, really, really rough opponents, Notre Dame is going to be out there playing, Texas A&M in round 1 or game 1, a team that a lot of people have as a preseason top 25 team. And so, when you look at it that way, Vince, you say, hey, listen, that's part of what makes it a tougher schedule. When you look at it from the standpoint of, okay, do you have stretches where you have lots of road games in a row? Are you going to be away from home for a good chunk of the month? I think it was last year, the year before, I believe there was a stretch where they were on the road 3 out of 4 weeks or something along those lines. It was within the last couple of years. Like later in the season, that can be rough.
Right.
Do you have stretches where, like last year, overall, we didn't think the schedule was super hard, but that stretch that began with Ohio State and ended with USC was going to be pretty rough because we
ended up being rough.
Really thought Duke was a much better team than people thought. And prior to Riley Leonard getting hurt, they were. So it was that stretch was going to make or break. I think we even said this directly. That's going to make or break your season. And guess what? It broke it.
Yeah, because they went 2-4.
They went 2-2.
Right, that's what I meant. 2 out of the 4.
Yeah. Right, and then almost lost another.
Right
in that stretch. I mean, they were closer to being 1-3 than they were to 3-1.
Sure,
in that stretch.
Because
you could argue, well, Ohio State, but like you didn't. You were trailing Ohio State most of that game. You didn't take a lead until the 4th quarter. You should have won the game, but you were losing that game for most of the game. It was the exact opposite of the year before, where Notre Dame had a lead most of the game and lost it. This year they were trailing most of the game, got a lead back, and then still lost. So when you look at it this year, Vince, I think the overall layout of the schedule is really works out well for Notre Dame.
Agreed.
And the reason I say that is there's a couple reasons why. Number one is you are getting a really good team out of the way early.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting Texas A&M out of the way early. It's similar to what we said about other teams. Like, I don't know that if I want to play that team in November, they're going to be a lot better than they are. There's no two road games back to back. Now there are games where you have back to back away from home games, but they're not back to back road games. So you look at Georgia Tech and Navy, back to back road games or back to back games away from home, but one's in Mercedes-Benz, which is a home game for Georgia Tech. It's their city. The other one's playing Navy in New Jersey. There will be more Notre Dame fans in the stadium that day than there will be Navy fans. And then there's back-to-back games away from home against Army and USC. USC's a road game, but they're playing Army in Yankee Stadium. So there's not back-to-back like you've got to go on the opposing team's campus like we saw with Duke and Louisville last year. So it's a little bit of a different animal in that regard, Vince. So I think that part sets up nicely. You don't have – go ahead.
I was going to say the other part that sets up nicely, and you kind of touched on it, the fact that they get one of their big ones out of the way in quarter one. As I'm looking at the 4 quarters, and then I look at the way I rank the teams, there's of my top 4 teams ranked, there's one in each quarter. one in the first quarter, one in the second quarter, one in the third quarter, and one in the fourth quarter. They're spread out.
Because you and I have the same top four. We have them in different order.
Right.
But we have the same top four.
So it still applies to yours as well then.
Correct. It does. Yeah. No, because I'm looking at mine because they have my number 3 is in quarter 1, my number 4 is in quarter 2, my number 1 is in quarter 3, and my number 2 is in quarter 4.
Yeah, right.
Right. So I think your number 1 is in quarter 1.
Yep.
Your number 2 is in quarter 3. Your number 3, I believe, is in quarter 4, and then your number 4 is in quarter 2.
Correct.
Because
they're spread out.
4. Right.
They're spread out, which is
and there's a team that's 8 or lower in each quarter.
That's true.
My number 12 is in quarter 4. My number 11 is in quarter 3. My number 10 is in quarter 1, and my number 8 is in quarter 2. So, to your point, Vince, that allows you to have some balance. You don't have that same gauntlet that you had, and I think that's good. It doesn't necessarily prepare you for the playoff, but by the time you get to the playoff, you're better more prepared for that, right? Yeah. And you've got more time off in between games. You have more than a week in between games, and you're not in school, so it's a different scenario anyway.
Agreed.
But I do think this is a schedule that provides you with some push, but is not set up in a way where you're going to be worn down. Right. In my opinion, you're just not going to have that back-to-back gauntlet that teams have had in the past. Notre Dame teams have had in the past. And so when I look at this team, Vince, I feel like, okay, that's something that is favorable for Notre Dame. That you could argue is definitely makes this schedule softer than last year's. Okay, that part's fair.
Yes.
I think the schedules of quality of teams of the last 2 years is very similar. Very similar. They're both softer than 22 because 22 had 2 legit really good teams in USC and Ohio State that bookend the season both on the road. And then you had Clemson at home in the middle of that. You had North Carolina on the road in the middle of that. Like that was a much tougher schedule, in my opinion. This year's schedule is not that type of season, but where you can look and say this is the most manageable schedule of the last 3 years. That I would agree with 100%.
Yeah.
100%. This is the kind of layout. So again, I have no issue with the 12 teams on the schedule. I would have done it a little bit different, but I'm not upset about it. And I don't think people should be focused on the lower part of the schedule because, again, everybody has that. Like I pointed out how bad Bama's schedule is the bottom. I even talk about the fact that they also have Vanderbilt that year. We talk about, I was talking about Georgia and how Georgia has UMass and has, Tennessee Tech and all that. Well, look, they're going to play Florida. They're probably going to be not very good. So Georgia Tech doesn't rank much further down on their schedule than they will on Notre Dame. So, there's a lot of things you could point at and say, well, yeah, I get that you're upset about that, but how's that any different than, what a lot of other teams play? The bottom of Bama's schedules, Western Kentucky, South Florida, Vanderbilt, and Mercer. So Notre Dame's schedule is not unique, although some people like to kind of over-obsess on the bottom teams. That's not what defines the toughness of a schedule. It's not. It's the top and the middle. Everybody has a soft – I think USC is probably the only team that I've seen that just there's no bottom.
Right.
Like the bottom – like USC schedules one where and this is where, I thought Colin Cowherd's entire argument was stupid. But at the same time, you could look at it and say, okay, but it's still – there's merit to this schedule. But this schedule was put together in a unique situation because this schedule was put together when you thought you're still going to be in the Pac-12.
Right.
The future schedules are a little bit different. Last year, Vince, you look at their toughest team, their weakest team on the perceived weakest team on their schedule. So when you look at their 12 team schedule, USC this year, there's only one non-Power 5 on their schedule. It's Utah State, who played the bowl game last year.
Right.
Because their non-conference schedule this year is because they're playing 9 games. It's LSU, Notre Dame, and Utah. That's a little nuts. Like that, but like that's unique. Everybody else has a bottom similar to Notre Dame's. That's what's like, oh, well, they play 2 service academies. Okay, would you rather them play Tennessee Tech and UMass? That would make you feel better because that's the bottom of Georgia's schedule. You know what I mean? It's not the bottom, it's the top.
Right.
And so that's kind of how I view it. But I do think the way that Notre Dame has done this well is they've laid it out really well. Because the reason is, Vince, you get that one gauntlet stretch of your schedule, that can wear you out for the rest of the year. It can. Or you could suffer enough injuries in that stretch that you're now not the team that you were. And that's kind of what happened to Notre Dame last year. They had a lot of guys kind of go down from that Ohio State to USC stretch.
Mm-hmm.
This year, I really like the way that it's laid out because you got that really tough game at the beginning. Then you've got 3 winnable games. Not all easy, right? I mean, there's 2 bowl teams in between Texas A&M and Louisville, but they're teams you should beat and beat convincingly. Then you get Louisville coming up. Then you've got a nice stretch in between there, a 3-game stretch between there and Florida State. That, again, some decent games in there, but teams you should beat. Stanford, Georgia Tech, Navy. Then you play Florida State. And then between Florida State and USC is Virginia and Army. Again, not necessarily cakewalks. You got to earn those wins, but you're also not playing Ohio State, putting all your energy and effort into that. And then the next thing you know, you got to play Marshall the next week.
Right.
A 9-10 win Marshall team. Or you play Ohio State and you put all your ducks into that game, and then you've got to go play Duke on the road the next week, who would have been a 10-win team last year if Riley Leonard doesn't get hurt. Let's just be real about that too. And so the layout I like. Every tough game you have, Vince, is followed by a game you absolutely should win convincingly.
Correct.
After A&M, you get Northern Illinois at home.
Yep.
That's a solid MAC team, but it's a MAC team. I mean, that's the thing. I'm not sitting there trying to say like Notre Dame might lose to a MAC team. It's embarrassing that they almost lost to Toledo a couple years ago. That's embarrassing.
It's embarrassing they almost lost to Ball State a few years ago.
Exactly. They should blow out the best MAC teams every year. I don't care how good they are. With the exceptions of that Ben Roethlisberger type team where you have a legitimate top 5 NFL draft pick on your roster. Okay, I get that. But those are anomalies. Those are once every 20, 30 years. Yes, they should blow those teams out, but it's also not like playing Tennessee State. They played Central Michigan last year. They are a crap MAC team. That's different than playing Northern Illinois and Miami of Ohio. But it's a game you should win convincingly. Then you get Purdue on the road. Not an easy game, not a cakewalk, but a game you are clearly the better team. And you got Miami of Ohio. Same thing. Quality team, won 11 games last year. But a team that I don't care how good they are, you should win that game and win that game convincingly.
Right.
Then you get Louisville. That's your next big game. Right? That's part of the big 4 that we talk about. But then what follows that? 3-9 Stanford, 7-6 Georgia Tech, 5-7 Navy. All winnable games. Then after Navy, you get a bye before you play Florida State. And then you come out of the Florida State game, you come home, and you get Virginia home, who I think is going to be a scrappy team this year. But a team where your roster is way better than their roster. And then you get Army and then USC. So there's no back-to-back, wow, that's going to be a rough back-to-back stretch. You could argue, Vince, that the toughest back-to-back stretch is Miami of Ohio and Louisville. You could argue that that's the toughest 2-game stretch that Notre Dame's going to play this year.
I'm reordering my stuff as we speak here because listening to you talk.
Well, stand your ground, Vince.
I am standing. It's
Marshall last.
These are these are tweaks. It's not drastic. It's my bottom 4 is still my bottom 4, but I'm just kind of reordering.
Your top 4 is still your top 4. Yeah,
my top 4 is still my top 4. Yeah,
that's my thing though, Vince. Is that's something that helps Notre Dame because your other 2. So it's Texas A&M and Northern Illinois, and then it's either Louisville or Miami or Louisville and Stanford. Then it's either Florida State and Navy or Florida State and Virginia, and then it's Army and USC. So, I would argue 11-win Miami of Ohio, 10-win Louisville. That's your toughest back-to-back stretch. With all due respect to trying to defend Notre Dame's schedule, which I've done while trying to relay a realistic aspect of it.
Exactly.
That's a good layout because you're not having that brutal gauntlet of a back-to-back like you had last year.
That was,
and even 2022 had a pretty rough start. You had at Ohio State, a really good Marshall team. A talented a Cal team that was scrappy, coming bowl caliber-ish type of team, and then you had North Carolina, who's a pretty good team, and then BYU. I mean, that was a tough start to that season. This year's a little bit. And last year, you could argue last year's schedule was a little too soft at the beginning. Navy to start, then Tennessee State, then a pretty good NC State team on the road, then Central Michigan. It's okay, it's a little too soft. I think this is a nice
4-0 start.
Yeah, this is a nice in between of those 2 that removes any of those brutal gauntlets. That's my feeling of the overall view of the schedule, Vince, as we dive into the quarters.
Yep. So let's dive into quarter number 1. So quarter number 1, I'll lay it out. Obviously, they're on the road at Texas A&M. Then they come home for their home opener a week later, Northern Illinois, and then a week later on the road at Purdue. So 2 away games, 2 out of their 3 legitimate on a campus away games on this schedule happen in the first quarter.
Yeah.
Which I also think is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so they'll get those out of the way pretty quickly, because then you don't have another one that is, well, on campus, I guess, is USC, which is not really on campus.
Yeah, exactly. Those are your only 2 on campus road
right.
games.
I mean, that's where they play all their home games. So it's like,
right.
but it's not on campus.
It's a true road game, but it's not a true on campus road game.
So really, the only 2 on campus road games are in the first quarter, right? Yeah. So again, as you mentioned before, I've got one of my top 4 teams in this first quarter, and I've got one of my bottom 4 teams in this quarter. And that's how it lays out for me the entire way. And I think you as well. There's a top, there's a bottom, and then there's a middle in all 4 quarters, which, I mean, you can't plan it out much better than that, to be honest with you. I mean, it's a very nice span of games as far as the difficulty level, in my opinion.
Here's what I like about the quarter 1, Vince, is you're going to be tested right away with that A&M game.
It won't be hard to be focused in game 1.
No. And then you've also 2 weeks later got to go on the road in what'll be a different type of road game, because normally Notre Dame's used to getting on the bus, driving to the airport, flying to their next game. This is one of those ones you're going to be sitting on a bus for 3 hours going down to West Lafayette on Friday. So when I look at the game, Vince, look, the Purdue game is a challenge. You've got 2 bowl teams in this first quarter. A&M last year was in a bowl game. Texas A&M or Northern Illinois is in a bowl game. Purdue was 4-8. They had some competitive losses. They weren't like a bad 4-8 team. They were an okay 4-8 team. But you're going to be on the road 2 of your first 3 games right when school starts. That's a mentally tough situation to be in. That's going to kind of test this team physically and mentally right away. You're going to get a very early glimpse of who is this team. Whereas last year it was kind of like they just overwhelmed their first 4 opponents.
Yeah.
Right. This A&M team to me is going to be tougher on the road than NC State was. It's a more talented team. It's now going to be better coached.
And the environment is much different, much bigger, better than NC State. I mean, it's not even close.
Let's be honest too. The hurricane happens, not the hurricane, but the weather issue happens early in quarter 2. The crowd was never as big after that delay. There's a lot of people that didn't come back.
And that's where Notre Dame took over, was at that point. Like it was
nothing. It was 3-0 at that point in time. Notre Dame was winning 3-0. And then, of course, next play back, Audric goes at 80 yards for a touchdown. Yeah. But the crowd was never the same after that delay. That factors in. It's not going to be the case in Kyle Field.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what happens. That crowd's not going anywhere.
Right.
I promise you that.
Right. So it's going to be a much tougher situation. So I do think this is, even though this isn't my toughest quarter, it's not even my number 2 toughest quarter based on how I did it.
Yeah.
This is a good early test, because I
agreed.
I don't, as a coach, Vince, I don't love the notion of you get fall camp, you don't get a scrimmage, and then your first 4 games you're not really tested, but maybe once. I don't love that. I like the fact this team is going away from home on true road campuses in 2 of their first 3 games. I actually kind of like that. I like the fact that you've got teams that you're supposed to beat in games 2 and 3, but they're not like New Mexico 2019 where you pop on the film and you just laugh. It's like, this is embarrassing. I can't believe we're playing this football team. That's how you look at it when you're a coach on that type of team or a player. These are teams like, you know what? Hey, these guys got some dudes. And, Purdue got like 5 transfers from Georgia, including a receiver that Notre Dame tried to recruit a couple years ago, CJ Smith, that real fast track kid. So that they're going to have some kids that you look at and say, okay, we got to bring it. We got to bring it. And so I do like how this schedule starts, Vince. I do. And
well, go ahead.
No,
I was going to say the other thing I like about this is it's the focus piece, right? There's not going to be any questions about whether this team is going to be focused and ready to go for game 1. And I also feel like game 1, if they win it, like they should, it sets them up nicely for the rest of the season, right? Because if they lose game 1, then the margin for error is razor thin the rest of the season. I mean, it's just
not where you want to be.
It's not where you want to be at all. If you win this game, then okay, We got a tough one in the rear view now. We know kind of who we are. Okay, let's start. Let's get into this season and let's go. And there is obviously room for error. You don't want to error, obviously. It's just I feel like having a game like this up front, on the road, all of those different things, just if you take care of business the way that you should, it just sets up nicely for the rest of the season. And that's what I like about this Texas A&M game for sure. And then, of course, they get to come home against a team that obviously you should beat. And then you go on a road against obviously a team that you should beat. But that road game to Purdue, and I don't know if we're jumping into this part, but that's my trap game. I mean, I'm not saying that Notre Dame is going to lose that game, but I don't want them, like, they should be able to beat Northern Illinois without much of an issue, right? I mean, they should be able
just so people are clear, we're going to kind of look at potential trap games in each quarter.
Right.
Then we will tell you what our one trap game is on the season. But so that's why Vince is talking about trap games in this quarter.
Yeah. And so, but like you said, they're going on a bus. They're going down to Purdue for the first time in a while. Purdue has a history of spoiling some seasons for some teams.
It's been a while.
But it's been a while. Agreed.
For Notre Dame, it's been a while. Yeah.
Agreed. But it's a trap game because I can easily see how you can overlook this particular game. It could easily see, hey man, we're just getting on the bus, no big deal. We're coming back that night, like, or the day of the game. Like I don't know. I see this as being a potential trap game.
Well, they'll go down Friday night. They'll go down Friday.
Right. And they'll come back on Saturday after the game.
Right. So they won't drive their day of.
Right.
Correct. Here's Vince, everything you said makes total sense. There's one reason why I don't agree with this game being the trap game. Marcus Freeman's been fired once in his life. Who fired him? Purdue.
That's right.
Like, this is going to be one Marcus Freeman wants. Do you remember how they suffocated Jeff Brom's offense in 2021? Marcus Freeman, you and I were sitting beside each other, I think, in the stands of that game, Vince. Freeman had a little extra something in his giddy up that game.
A little extra sauce.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, there's a little extra something there with him, right?
And now he's going down there. Yeah.
Yeah. Now he's going back to his stomping grounds. He'll have this in every other year, Vince. You'd be spot on in that analysis. Yeah. I think the only thing that, Marty Biagi's coached there. He came from Purdue. So there's that's why I don't think that the Northern Illinois game would be my potential trap game of this one, for similar reasons to what Marshall was a couple years ago, although this Northern Illinois team just isn't as good as what Marshall was 2 years ago. Yeah. But it's just that coming, I always worry about you come, it's like the Ball State game in 2018. You put all this effort into that one big game to start the season that a lot of people are saying, like, you win that game and you go on a roll, because that's what people are saying about 2018.
Sure.
That you looked at Notre Dame's schedule in 2018 and you're like, if you beat Michigan in the opener, I don't know who's going to beat that football team, because, you had Virginia Tech on that schedule on the road. Okay, maybe that's a tough one, but, Virginia Tech wasn't a great football team. They're coming off of a decent 9-4 season, but they were just kind of okay, if we're being honest about who that Virginia Tech team was. But who else was on the schedule? You had Ball State, Vanderbilt, Wake Forest, Stanford, Virginia Tech, Pitt, Navy, Northwestern, a bad Florida State team, Syracuse, and USC. And Syracuse is coming off of a year in which they went 4-8. We didn't see that 10-win season coming. You know what I mean? So it was just a little bit of a different deal. It was a little bit of a tougher structure, in my opinion. But this year is tougher. But there's that sentiment of, you win this game and you're probably rolling until Florida State. It's a similar mindset. So that year it was, you beat them and you're rolling. I mean, you're not going to lose another game. Maybe Virginia Tech, maybe, but you're steamrolling the rest of your schedule. This one, it's like, dude, you're rolling until November 9th. And then you're going to get tested again by them. So I just think that Northern Illinois game is, if you win, if you go on the road and play really well against A&M, there's that come down effect of, okay, now you're playing a MAC team. But if you lose that game, then there's the concern of, is there that letdown because you didn't? I'm hoping.
Yeah, I'm hoping that if they go and take care of their business like they should, against Texas A&M, and then they come back. I'm hoping that because it is now. Granted, there was the same situation in 22, but I'm hoping because it's the first home game of the year, you get a little, that little charge because it's first home game, things like that. Didn't work against Marshall. So it's like I'm almost arguing against myself here, but that was year 1 Marcus Freeman, though. This is year 3 Marcus Freeman.
Right.
I feel like there's a big difference there. He's not going to let that happen again.
Right. And the problem is the other thing too is that was year 1 Marcus Freeman that you mentioned, but a lot of the other home, like we had some summer in 2021, start the season off on the road at Florida State, and then you come home and you sleepwalk through the Toledo game.
Yeah.
You talk about that big home win against Michigan in 2017 or 18, and then the next week you go out and barely beat a Ball State team that was terrible, coming off a 2-10 season, was not very good that year, not even close to being as good as Northern Illinois, not even close. And
they were 4-8 that year when they almost beat Notre Dame.
Right,
they were 4-8.
Well, and I'll say they almost beat it. They played Notre Dame.
It was a single-digit game, and it should not have been.
It should have been 24-3 at halftime if you played bad.
Right.
That in that week, that was a week where Marcus Freeman, if you remember, didn't play the first team very much in practice. We found out later. So of course your team slept. I don't think Marcus Freeman makes that mistake.
I mean, Brian Kelly.
Brian Kelly. Who did I say?
You said Marcus Freeman.
Marcus Freeman.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, Brian Kelly did that with that 2018 team going into the Ball State game. I don't see that, but
they had total plans. Yeah, they were like, "Oh, they're going to be out at halftime. Doesn't matter. We're going to get these guys ready to play." And that was the dumbest thing you could have done.
So I do think that Northern Illinois, because sometimes, Vince, that first home game can be sort of there's a lot going on.
Sure.
And it can be distracting. So that's why Northern Illinois. But overall, this is a good early test of a quarter, but not one that you worry about wearing you out a little bit too soon.
It's not my hardest quarter. Are we going to rank our quarters when we're all done?
We'll do it when we're all done.
Okay, gotcha.
We'll rank it and then just state your case of why you have the top couple teams the way you do, or maybe why you're down on one more than you are others.
All right, so quarter 2 shapes out like this. You got Miami of Ohio at home. You've got Louisville at home. And you've got Stanford at home. So this is the only quarter where it's all home games, back to back to back. And they're all 3:30 games. Well, I shouldn't say back to back to back because there is a bye in there. All right.
Yeah, between
where's Louisville and Stanford?
That's right. And then the second bye is between Navy and Florida State.
Florida State, correct. So they're all home games. They are back to back to back on the schedule, but there is a bye game squeezed in there. They're all afternoon games. I mean,
all three. You're right. All 3:30, and they're all red.
They're all red. That's a good point. I hate red.
I've never seen anything like that before, where you have 3 teams in a row that are just red.
And I use red.
Version of red.
So you got almost 4 out of 5. Excuse me.
Yeah, this is an interesting part of the schedule, Vince, because I actually think this is going to be a more challenging part of the schedule than I think a lot of Notre Dame fans think it is, because I don't think a lot of Notre Dame fans recognize how good Miami of Ohio was last year. Again, Notre Dame should pound Miami of Ohio.
Yeah.
I'm simply saying this isn't like playing New Mexico in 2019 or Bowling Green in 2019 or Ball State in 2018. This is a good MAC team, right? To me, this will be a tougher game than playing like Boise State.
Yeah,
8-6.
Oh, I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Now, I think Boise might be better next year if their coach is good, but that's kind of where I think that I don't think people recognize that.
Right.
And then Louisville's Louisville's probably the one game that I don't know that Notre Dame has a lot of games circled on their schedule. I hope that this is one of them. I mean, they have that one game at a time, and we're taking it one game at a time.
You can still circle a game though,
and we're not. Yeah, this is one that I hope that Notre Dame looks and says, "Oh, we got this one scheduled. We got this one circled."
Yeah,
because of not only just losing to them, getting embarrassed by them last year, a lot of trash talking being done by Louisville and their fans. So then we're going to find out, like, is this is like Notre Dame, Michigan, Ohio State, and Michigan after 2021. Now, Louisville was smart enough not to run their mouths like the entire offseason after that, but I'm curious what they're going to have to say before going into that game. But it's that game where they ran their mouths, they talked trash, their fans were horrible. My wife was like, that was one of the worst environments I've ever been in, because she shot that game. But it was rough, and some pretty ridiculous things being yelled at Notre Dame players. I gotta hope this one's circled on the calendar.
Yeah.
As like, this is one of those ones where if we can beat them by 50, we will.
Yes.
Well,
and I think it has the potential to be a statement game. Look, Jeff Brom's a good coach, and I think Louisville's going to be a good team. They're going to be a ranked team. Now, I'm not saying they're going to be a top 10 team, but I think that at the end of the year, I think they're going to be ranked. And so you want to rack up those ranked opponent victories, obviously. And if you can make a statement like that, we were talking like biggest game, toughest game. This is a potential statement game, in my opinion. Look, in my opinion, Notre Dame was a bit outcoached last year as well in the Louisville game. And
Notre Dame's offense, certainly.
Okay.
Yeah. And that first series from Jeff Brom against Al Golden was a masterclass.
Yes.
Now, Golden reacted, like he rebounded, and they shut him down the road. But like that first drive, Notre Dame had no answers as they went down on that touchdown drive.
Agreed. And so this is going to be circled not just by the players, but also by the coaching staff, I would hope, because coaches have a memory, and they got a long memory generally you just talked about Marcus Freeman and Purdue, right? They're going to remember this game. And I just feel like, look, Mike Denbrock obviously wasn't here last year, and so it's a different set of circumstances as far as the offense is concerned. But this game has to be circled. It has to be this, like I said, it has the potential to be a statement game, and I hope that it is a statement game. I hope they go out there, leave no doubt against Louisville, right? They're not going to look past this one. That's for sure. Like, there's no way you could, in my opinion, there's no way you could say, well, this is a trap game. This is they're going to overlook this. There's no way that this game gets overlooked. There's no way it gets overlooked. This is a revenge game. This is a potential statement game. This is a game that Notre Dame needs to bring everything they've got. With that said, I think the Miami game is the trap game here because, and I'm not saying it necessarily for the players, but definitely for fans. It's a MAC team. Doesn't matter. They're going to blow them out. They're going to do this. They're going to do that. And that may very well end up happening. But this Miami program with Chuck Martin at the helm has been pretty stinking good the last 5 years or so. And so this is a game you cannot overlook at all. And I realize it's a home game. Everything lines up for you very nicely. It's the second best game, in my opinion, second best opponent in this quarter. You got to come to play that game. Now, if you play the way you're supposed to play, you can get all your buddies into the game later on. But you've got to come to play that game, and you got to put it away early because this is the kind of team that will hang around and could potentially bite you in the butt if you don't take care of your business.
Stanford's my trap game. Now, overall toughness, we talked about it. Stanford's my trap game for the same exact reason they were 2 years ago. Like, they're terrible. Everybody knows they're terrible. But they're more talented now than they were 2 years ago when they came into Notre Dame Stadium and beat Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame's more talented, but still, you start the season off 5-0, and you've got road wins over A&M and Purdue, and then you've got you get your revenge against Louisville. Like, okay, you can say whatever you want, but now they're starting to look ahead. They're kids. They're teenagers. They're early 20-somethings, right? We can say all they want. Just focus on one game at a time, but you start peeking ahead. Once you get past Louisville, you start peeking ahead to what's next, and it's Florida State. And then Stanford's a team to kind of, they got enough talent to where if you come in and lay an egg like you did 2 years ago, they can beat you. And you can say, well, it's a different staff. Yeah, kind of. It's the same head coach, same coordinator on defense. I mean, so there's a lot of changes, but this is still the same staff. This isn't like you can say, well, yeah, it was Brian Kelly's staff that laid an egg against Ball State. So it's a little bit different. No, I think this is something where this is a prove-it game for me for Marcus Freeman. Look, this team beat you at your place last time. Take control of the series. Show me how your team – what do we always say, Vince? Your team, you got to learn that you can handle adversity, but then you also got to show me you can handle success. Let's say Notre Dame goes out and smacks Louisville. So, to me, Miami of Ohio is my trap game. Or as the trap game, I understand, Vince, to your point, because you're looking ahead to Louisville. 100% get it. But I think the 11 wins from last year – is kind of going to be enough. You got the Chuck Martin angle. It's that Stanford game. If you beat Louisville, like I think you're going to beat Louisville, that's why this game. That's why the Stanford game scares me because I'm projecting a little bit onto Notre Dame having a convincing home win over Louisville.
Sure,
I'm projecting that a little bit, and then I worry about okay. Let's say you beat A&M and you beat Louisville and you handle your business really impressive against Louisville. Do you sleepwalk through Stanford? And I don't know that this team is quite good enough yet to sleepwalk, wake up, and then just pound a team. I think they got to still show that a little bit. Now, do I think Stanford has a chance to beat Notre Dame? No, I don't, because I don't think Marcus Freeman's – I think he's – one thing about Marcus Freeman is he's learned – he's shown he can learn quickly from his mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
we haven't seen a repeat of the Stanford game.
Right.
So –
and I think there's enough
difference.
My only pushback is I think there's enough players still on this roster that remember Stanford from
they got to prove it.
Absolutely.
Right.
I agree. I would agree with everything that you said. And it makes a lot of sense, especially if they're coming in 5-0 into that game, especially at a potentially emotional statement win against Louisville, just like I said that they needed to do, the potential to sleepwalk through that game. I think their memories are long enough that they're going to remember this, and it might be a little mini statement game. Now, it's not going to be a statement game nationally, and I totally get that, but I think it could be for them
internally.
Yes,
yeah, there's some things. Okay, we're not letting this happen again.
Yes,
right.
Exactly, correct.
100% agree. So this is a surprisingly challenging stretch of the schedule that I don't think a lot of fans are looking at. But quarter 3 though, that's a little bit of a different animal.
So quarter 3, let's break it down. They are on the road at a neutral site, kind of, in Atlanta, playing against Georgia Tech. Then they are at Navy, right? And obviously not on campus, neutral site. And then they are home against Florida State. And then Florida State is the night game. That's the big one. It's the one everybody's got circled, I'm assuming. Your game against Georgia Tech is still undefined as far as what time that game is going to be on the road. If Notre Dame is 6-0 going into that game, I could very easily see that being a night game. And then Navy's at noon, which is friggin' great. So it's a noon game against Navy. Then they have the bye, and then they have Florida State at home. That's the home night game that they'll have this season. So what say you on the third quarter?
I'm kind of anticipating that this is going to be a night game.
Me too.
So
I am too.
I do. But this is a challenging schedule because you've got 2 games away from home,
right?
Which you have in quarter 1. The difference, however, is because that's the interesting thing about quarter 2 that we didn't mention. They're all at home, or maybe you did and I just missed it, but they're all at home.
Yeah.
So that's why you actually have 2 games away from home in every other quarter. Quarter 1 has 2 games away from home. Quarter 3 has 2 games away from home. And then quarter 4 has 2 games away from home.
Good call.
Because quarter 2 is all home. So when I look at this quarter, obviously you've got the big one at the end of the quarter. I mean, it ends with the big dog on the schedule, in my opinion.
Sure.
It is the best team on the schedule. Maybe not the toughest game. We'll debate that in section 3. But I think it's something you and I agree on, the best team on the schedule. Is that something we agree on?
Oh, without
just
a doubt.
So you all know, the ranking of our schedule is actually by toughest games, not the best opponents. But so, when you're playing, where you're playing, all that factors in. I think this is the best team on the schedule.
Yes. You're getting no argument from me on that one.
Because you had them winning the ACC. You have them in, getting a bye in the college football playoff. So, Vince, when I look at it, that's going to be a challenging schedule. And then you kick this quarter off, playing basically on the road against Georgia Tech. It's not a true road game, but it's a road game. And a stadium that Georgia Tech's going to be a lot more familiar with because they play games there every year. I think they played Louisville there to kick the season off last year. I think they played in Mercedes-Benz. So
it's a home away from home. I mean,
exactly.
Let's be honest. That's where they go. For their biggest games of the year, they go there. Their biggest home games,
exactly.
I mean,
exactly,
more or less.
So to me, Vince, I think that's a challenging part of it. Then you're flying back. So you're flying down to Atlanta. You're coming home. You're flying over to Jersey. You're coming home. And then it's the Seminoles.
Yeah.
And then I worry about you've got a Georgia Tech who's going to be a talented team and then a triple option team that's a unique animal all before what we all know the players are going to be looking ahead to, which is Florida State. And looking ahead can just mean something simple as okay, let's handle our business here so we can get ready for that. I mean, it's human nature.
Sure.
You can say all you want. You think there's going to be any kid on the schedule that's going to look ahead and be like, I don't know who we play after Navy. Yeah, they know who they're playing after Navy. They know exactly who they're playing after Navy. That doesn't mean they're obsessing over it, and that's where it becomes a problem. every day it's like Florida State. Guys, we got Navy this weekend. Can we not worry about Florida State just yet? That's where you want to be. But that's what makes this one tough, because this is the only quarter for me, Vince, that you have 2 top 5 opponents as well. So 2 games away from home. You have 2 of your top 5 opponents.
Yep.
And you play the big dog on your schedule. The number 1 team, the best team on your schedule. And now we're getting later in the year. Now where that travel starts to maybe have a little bit more wear and tear. The good news is, however, as you pointed out, there is a bye week between those 2 games away from home and then the Florida State game, which I think is big. So, yeah, because I'll be honest, I'd be a little bit more nervous about this layout of this schedule if you had Navy, no bye, no Florida State.
Absolutely. 100%.
Because now you get some time to deprogram from the triple option, which is going to be helpful.
I think the buys are very nicely placed in this schedule. I really do. And this one in particular, because of the style of play of Navy and then the big game in Florida State. I mean, you have a chance to kind of decompress from the triple option, kind of figure things, get things pointed in the right direction for what is going to be Florida State. And there's not too many teams out there that are as diametrically opposed offensively as Navy and Florida State. So it's going to be a good opportunity to kind of, okay, we can not flush Navy and their triple option because you got Army down the road in a few weeks, but you've got this bye to kind of ease out of it. And you kind of put that game plan to the side just briefly, and then you can bring it back when you play Army a few weeks later. But I do like the positioning of that bye. It makes a lot of sense. And it's before arguably the biggest game of the year. At least the toughest opponent of the year. And so, especially, if Notre Dame is 3-6-8-0 going into the Florida State game, it's going to be a massive game. And if Florida State is who we think they are, they're going to be undefeated, maybe have a loss, in there. And so this is a college game day type of weekend. And so there's going to be a lot of distractions. There's going to be a lot of this and a lot of that. And if you have 2 weeks to prepare as opposed to 1 week to prepare, I like Notre Dame's chances here, right? And so that's why this sets up so nicely for Notre Dame. And I agree with you completely. It was a little close, I'm not going to lie, but it is my hardest quarter of the 4. I mean, that's not giving anything away. No matter where we have things ranked, it is still 2 of the top 5 for both of us, right? And you got to give it to that quarter. Right. I mean, it's 2 of the top 5.
Giving away the rankings already, man.
Well, you said 2 of the top 5 already.
I know.
I was just repeating you. I'm keeping very close tabs on what you're saying.
Top quarter.
Well, okay. I did give that away. I thought maybe you kind of hinted at that, but
are you new here or something, Vince?
It's my top quarter. Look, the fact that there's 2 of the top 5
lean
into
in
1 quarter. I'm going right.
What's I mean, like to me, when I look at trap game, in this one, it's Navy.
Sure.
For me.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It's not. There's a lot of people out there. I think that when they look at the overall schedule, they look at Georgia Tech as being a potential trap game or a potential trip up, for Notre Dame. I don't see that. I think Georgia Tech is going to be a formidable opponent. Yeah. But at this point, they're going to be they got the potential to be
Georgia Tech in an NFL stadium. These Notre Dame players are going to be up for that game.
Correct.
I'd be more worried about Georgia Tech if they were playing at their stadium.
Yeah, I do too.
Honestly.
Yeah, I think that's a great call, actually. Yeah. And Notre Dame's used to playing in NFL stadiums. I mean, what was it, last year or the year before? Every away game, I think, was in an NFL stadium. It was like something ridiculous like that. This is what Notre Dame does. Like, they're going to be ready for this game. I just don't see that being a trip-up style of game. It's just Navy's just that weird animal, right? And it's that offense is not – now, they can't cut block anymore. They can't do the things that everybody – we had somebody talking yesterday when the Navy game came up, and they're like, I just want them to get out of there healthy. It's not the same as it used to be. They're not having to prepare for cut blocks and things like Notre Dame hasn't had drastic injuries coming out of those games like they used to.
It's not the same. And Navy's talking about Navy's not even talking about running that as much.
Right. So they're kind of
we talked about this earlier in the summer events. The blocking rules, it's playing the triple option is not the same on your legs. It's still difficult from a discipline standpoint. And all those same things that make it a challenge are still there. You make like Notre Dame caught a couple breaks against Navy. Now, Notre Dame was going to blow Navy out no matter what, but Navy's a couple touchdowns, missed throws by their quarterback away from scoring.
Sure.
Last year, Vince. And so, Yeah, you can't make those kind of mistakes, and then all of a sudden now you
Absolutely.
got to, because the thing is, okay, well, what's the concern? You're on the field longer. Like
Right.
Notre Dame, I believe, is at the point now as a program, and Navy has kind of come down enough as a program where I'm not worried about losing this game. It's more so getting them out of any momentum they may be building by winning
Sure.
an ugly game over a team like Navy.
Yes.
What's your confidence level like if you had to scrape through? Because I think part of the reason Notre Dame struggled against Vanderbilt in 2020 or in 2018 is because of they were just completely shook and had lost all momentum after the Michigan game by how bad they played against Ball State. And it took them a little bit to kind of get that rhythm back. And then, of course, they did, and they went out and whooped Wake Forest next week. But I think it was kind of that hangover from how poorly you played. And if Notre Dame plays poorly against Navy, you now got to sit on that for 2 weeks.
Right.
Because you have the bye.
And that's
So
not the taste in your
part.
mouth that you want when you're going into prep for potentially the biggest game of the year. Night game at home, Florida State, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, that's not the taste in your mouth that you want. Even coming off of victory, like, oh, well, we got through that one. That's like one of those ones where, you know what, we're not even going to watch that film. We got out of it. Like that's just not the vibe you want going into the bye, going into Florida State.
Obviously the Notre Dame defense isn't going to watch the film. There's like at least not until the Army week.
Not until the Army prep,
right?
Yeah, Army prep.
But the Notre Dame offense is going to watch it. That's always been the thing, and that's the other part. Playing the Navy hangover. I'm like, well, what does that have to do with the offense?
Yeah,
that doesn't explain why the offense stunk. That week or whatever. So it's going to be interesting. But this is a challenging schedule. But this is like the thing is like there's just one really not good team in each of these schedules.
Yeah.
Each of these slots, in my opinion. So in quarter 4, Vince, this is a very interesting one because this is a projection quarter.
Oh, yeah. 100%.
This is one where there aren't any good teams in this quarter from last year. Not a one. That's the best fair. Team you could argue, was what USC 8-5, and then Army was 6-6, but like 2 of their wins were FCS teams. And then you've got a Virginia team that went 3-9. Like this is the one quarter on your schedule where your opponents combined for a losing record. I'm pretty sure, right? So they went 14, 17, and then 5, 11, and 20. Yeah, so like had a losing record last year. But I also think this quarter is going to be tougher than maybe we think because I do project all 3 of these teams to be better than they were last year. How much better is going to determine how worn out Notre Dame is when they go play USC in the last stretch of the game.
Sure.
But this is a game that I believe both of us have as a top 2 toughest game, I believe.
Oh, top 3.
Top 3, okay.
Yeah,
we both have the USC game as one of the top 3 toughest games. But then also I my least toughest game, it's on here. So it's going to be an interesting part of the schedule, Vince, because it could be a cakewalk going into USC where you're really well rested. But I could also see them being scrappy enough because you've got a Virginia team that battles and competes, and then you've got an option team. Army's an interesting team because they tried to change their offense last year. Didn't work. They went back to their traditional offense.
Right.
I'm not sure if they're going to – I assume they're going to stick to their traditional offense this year. I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure what Army's going to try to do. And I'd be a little bit more nervous about Army maybe in the opener because I'm like, okay, are they going to be the traditional team? Are they going to try to go back to the changes they tried to make last year? I don't know. Because when they went back to, what they did last year, Vince, I believe, let me look that up real quick, but I believe they finished the year off pretty well last season. Yeah, they won their last 4 games. They beat Air Force by 20. They beat Coastal Carolina, and they beat Navy. So they finished the season off with 4 straight wins kind of after they had adjusted and gone back to their traditional offense. So I would imagine that this might be the game where we actually do see a more traditional triple option, whereas with Navy they're still trying to move away from
what they're trying to more of a hybrid-ish, yeah. Which I don't know how great of an idea that is, but whatever. Based on the guys that they are able to recruit and do recruit, I just don't know if that's a great idea, but hey,
agree.
But no, this quarter is very interesting because you're right. On paper, judging by last year, it's not a great quarter. It's not. And, this is an opportunity for Notre Dame to kind of put an exclamation point on their season, in my opinion, when you look at this quarter. It just is. And it, depending on what Notre Dame's record is going into the USC game on the road against USC. Look, they're going to have, regardless of what their record is, and it could be rough based on the schedule, there's still going to be some very intriguing matchups in this game. And there's going to be some things that you can look at going into this game. And that's going to be the last opportunity that Notre Dame has to make a case for the playoff. I mean, this is their last opportunity.
Well, this quarter 4, Vince, the one thing that stands out about this quarter 4 is that it's a concerning quarter for me. If Notre Dame has 2 losses coming into this quarter, I worry about their ability to make the playoff.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Because I don't know that they're going to have a chance to have a statement game.
Sure.
That's
I mean, going to USC, I would like to think has the potential to be a statement game. But if they look, the USC schedule is tough.
If everybody's right about USC this year, then I don't know that it can be a statement game.
Yeah.
That's the problem. I personally think they're going to be better than people think. That's where I come down on it. But
yeah,
if I'm wrong about USC this year,
the problem is, yeah,
you know, let's say you lose to Florida State, you don't have a chance to then rebuild your stock back up unless USC is as good as I think they're going to be. Well, so for Notre Dame fans, you should not be rooting against USC this year, folks.
Right, agreed.
Should not, because you need Notre Dame. You need them to be good because, as you said, Vince. Now maybe it's not going to matter. Maybe it doesn't keep them out of the playoff. You know, but let's say Notre Dame goes out there and they're 10-1, and USC is a top 12 team. Say they're 9-2, and Notre Dame goes out there and smacks them. No, Notre Dame they're jockeying now for seeding, which matters too. Maybe that puts them from 10-7. Well, that just sent you from a road game to a home game. Maybe it takes them from 7 to 5. You get up to 5, that now puts you from, you know, okay, you got to go play number 2 in the quarters to now you get the worst team in the playoff in round 1, and then you get the worst conference champion in round 2.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so that's where games like this matter, even if you're not just, maybe you've got you feel good about you're going to be in the playoff, but now you're for seeding, you need USC to be good. That's the thing. You need them to be good. Will they be? I don't know. I'm higher on this USC team than most. And I'm not going to get into that. We'll talk about that when we actually break down when we rank our 12. But this is a unique schedule, Vince, because part of it is, look, you're going to be, if these teams are what you and I think they're going to be, you're going to have 2 really cakewalk games and then 1 tough one. You're going to be kind of rested going into that last game, and then you got plenty of time to rest for the playoff.
Yeah.
It's not like your typical November gauntlet at the end of the season. Now, Florida State's part of that November schedule. That's going to be tough. But then the next couple are – but then this also, even though we can kind of take a step back out of the quarter 4 and just kind of look at it that way, that last 4, Florida State and USC, are 2 of your last 4 games.
That's true.
But again, there's 2 very, very winnable games in between, and that just fits into how well I think the schedule is put together.
What I'm nervous about with USC is that they are, let's say, a 500 or a little better team, and they are who people think they are, right? It's lose-lose going into that game. You should win that game on the road, and you should win it convincingly. And if you don't, your entire season has just gone down the toilet, frankly, if you're Notre Dame. Like, that is a tough spot to be in going on the road in the Coliseum against USC, you would think. Right? I hope USC is better than that this year, because I would love for that game to be a showdown game. Now, my heart won't like it because I'll be freaking out all day and, you know, all Thanksgiving break and everything else. But I would love for USC to be a very good team and Notre Dame to be a very good team, and that game to really, really mean something going into
the
postseason.
It may not. It needs to.
It may not. And I if I was a betting man, I'd say it probably won't be. But that's what I want. I mean, that's what I want. You know what I'm saying?
It's funny because people like root for USC. That's not happening. I'm like, okay, so what you're telling me is you hate USC more than you love Notre Dame. Like, that's the whole point.
Depends on
and the thing for me is I don't enjoy beating a bad USC team. It's like, well, you're supposed to do that. Like, most enjoyable win over USC of my lifetime, of the last 20 years, I should say, is last year in 2017. Why? Because those were years where USC fans really thought they actually were good.
Oh, last year was great, though.
And Notre Dame curb stomped them. Same thing with 2017 when they beat them 49-4. That was a top 12 USC team that you went out and smacked. I don't get any joy out of beating a bad USC team.
Right.
You know, like that's like, all right. It's just like I'm sure USC fans didn't probably get maybe the first couple years, but then after a while, it's just like, okay, this isn't even fun anymore. You know, these guys are just bad.
Last year was even more beautiful because when Notre Dame beat them and beat them and beat them, they did still think they were something. And it sent their season into just an absolute spiral. And that was just glorious. I mean, it maybe in the end it didn't work out great for Notre Dame because it didn't help the strength of schedule and all of that because
it didn't matter. Notre Dame lost 3 games.
But yeah, right, 100%. Yeah. But like it just felt good to know that Notre Dame did that to them. Yeah. Like they just stole their lunch
and
money.
It doesn't help Notre Dame.
Right.
If USC is not good either.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's my point.
Yeah,
that's absolutely. The big point. So anyway, so Vince, that's it for the quarter overviews. Let's rank the quarters real quick before we move into our overall ranking of the schedule.
You know, it's funny because I ranked my quarters based on my thoughts, like my initial thoughts of the teams, right? I went back and did the mathematical ranking of the quarters, and it's completely different. Like, I don't know how that actually went down, but I'm sticking with my gut feeling on the quarters because I feel like that's a more legit situation, and maybe that means I need to adjust my 1 through 12. But I'll start at the top because I already gave it away. My toughest quarter is quarter 3. The one that has Georgia Tech, Navy, and Florida State in it. That's my toughest quarter. How about you? Or do you want me to go through all 4?
Yeah, give me your 4.
So my second toughest quarter would be quarter 2, and that would be the Miami, Louisville, Stanford run. My third toughest quarter would be the opening quarter. That would be Texas A&M, Northern Illinois, and Purdue. And the fourth toughest quarter would be the final stretch, would be Virginia, Army, and USC.
So mine, Vince, I did more scientifically.
Yeah.
Not win-loss record, but basically how I ranked the 1 to 12.
Yeah.
And I added them up. And the team with the lowest points was number 1 because that means they had the higher ranked teams. So if you have play teams 1, 2, and 3, that's 6 points, right?
Right. Yep.
And it was exact same as yours. Quarter 3 had 17 points, which means they had the 1, the 5, and the 11. Quarter 2 was right behind it at 18 points. Quarter 1 was right behind it with 20, and then quarter 4 was way back with 23 points. There was as many points between quarter 3 and 1 and quarter 3 and quarter 1, which is first and third, than there is between quarter 1 and quarter 4, which is third and fourth, just based on where teams rank from last year. But quarter 3, that Florida State, that Georgia Tech, Navy, Florida State schedule is my toughest. And I think you could argue, I could maybe make a case that that the quarter 2 could end up being the toughest. I will say that because I do think I'm so back and forth on Stanford. Like, I think I had him at the bottom of the ACC rankings, but then the more I look at him, like, man, but there's some good talent there. But that's a challenge. Like, if they're better, if Stanford's better than I think they're going to be, then this could end up being the toughest quarter, even though I don't rank it that way now.
Sure.
And same thing with quarter 4. Like, right now, it is significantly my lowest quarter. I could see a case where if Virginia's as good as I think they might be, if Army kind of bounces back, and if they play this year like they finished last year, you could have 3 bowl teams at the end of the season. So I do think there's potential for a lot of flexibility, but based on what we know of the teams now, you and I agree. Quarter 3 is at the top, then it's quarter 2, then it's quarter 1, then it's quarter 4, as far as just the overall ranking of the schedules. So that's how I have the quarter breakdown as well, Vince. We're on the same page on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, and you're right. It doesn't do Notre Dame any favors that their least competitive potentially quarter is the last one. Like that, when you talk about what have you done for me lately, and that is usually the case when they're ranking teams at the end. We don't know what 1 through 12 is going to look like. We've only seen 1 through 4, but what have you done for me lately is kind of a big deal in the 1 through 4. And so I'm interested to see if this ends up coming to fruition and it's the weakest of the 4 quarters, those last 3 games. What does a month of not great games do for you? You know what I mean? And so that's why you need to root for USC, people. Like, you don't need to root for USC when they're playing against Notre Dame, but you need to root for them to win some games so that last game means something. Because That's always the biggest thing. You know, the last couple of years with Stanford not being good in the odd years when that's who they finish up with, it's like, okay, great. Like that's not going to help you in your argument for the postseason. You want USC to be good because that's the last statement. That's your closing argument, in a court case. That's your closing argument is your game at USC. And if USC is god awful or not good, then it's kind of a weak closing argument. And that's not great for Notre Dame if you want them to be hosting a game, in the playoff, I guess is the best way to put it. Now, if you're 12-0, it's not going to matter, obviously. But if you're 10-1 going into that game, and then 11-1, okay, you're probably hosting. If you've got 2 losses going into that game, USC's not going to help you, and you might be on the outside looking in at the end of the day, And so you want USC to be good. I'm telling you, and believe me, it's poison coming out of my mouth.
Yeah, I've never had the same hatred for USC that I do Michigan. I just haven't.
No, I agree with that.
Like I've always respected USC as a program in a lot of ways. I mean, it's like it's a rivalry that has been the standard you're supposed to evaluate yourself by.
Yes,
and that's what's missed from the last 20 years because in the 2000s, USC dominated it and Notre Dame was bad in a lot of years. Now, there's a couple great games in there. You had that 2009 game with Jimmy where he almost brought him back and won the game. Obviously, Brady had his huge game against him in 2005. But like USC in 2006 just pummeled Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And obviously 2007 embarrassed Notre Dame in 2007. I mean, just it won 8 in a row. And then Kelly kind of turns the tides. You have a little back and forth early on. Notre Dame wins in 10 and 12. And then USC and Notre Dame also won in 13. But then USC won in 11. USC won in 14. Notre Dame wins in 15. USC wins in 16. And then after that, it's been all Notre Dame. Notre Dame dominated in 17, dominated in 18, dominated in 19. No game in 2020. Notre Dame dominates in 2021 and didn't even play well. And then USC wins by 11 in 22. And then Notre Dame comes back last year and just annihilates USC. Like that's I want to beat USC when they're good. Right. But at the same time, the reason it matters even more is because forget all that. Forget the emotional part about I want to beat the rival when they're good, make it hurt more for the fan. I'm just practically speaking, looking at building your college football playoff resume. Do you really think it's good for Notre Dame for their last 3 games to be against Virginia, Army, and a mediocre to bad USC team? That is not good for Notre Dame.
Nope, that is not a good way to
even
close
if they're 11-1, because now it's like you're 11-1, but you haven't been talked about in a month.
Right. And now you're gonna lose ground to teams that lost in their conference championships. Like that's honestly what could potentially happen. You might be sitting behind the SEC runner-up. You could potentially be sitting behind the ACC runner-up, depending on how things shake out, even at 11-1. Now,
especially if your loss is to Florida State.
Right.
Now it's like the last meaningful game you played, you lost. That could be the difference when you get in the 5 seed or the 7 seed or the 7 seed or the 9 seed. Those things matter.
The further down you are, the better the team that you're playing at home. I mean,
it doesn't matter, Vince. Like, it didn't matter really if you were the 3 seed, 4 seed, 2 seed, 1 seed or whatever, because, I mean, you were going to have to play a neutral game against one of those teams anyway.
Right.
Now it's like you're talking about the difference between being at home or being away.
Yeah.
In your first playoff game.
Huge.
And then for Notre Dame, like, can you get that max seed to where now you play the worst team in the playoff and then you play the worst conference champion of the Power 4? That's what's in front of you by getting that 5 seed. So now jockeying for position is important.
Huge.
Very important for Notre Dame.
Do you want to be
if they're
hosting?
12-0, it won't matter.
Right, correct.
It won't matter. They'll be the 5 seed.
Right.
Because it's impossible to have an undefeated team like ranked ahead of you that doesn't win their league.
Right.
It's literally impossible.
Because they're up in the 1 through 4. I mean, that's
right. Unless you have like 3 conference champs tied at 12-0, and I don't even know how you'd even get to that.
Right.
That that would be about the only thing. But I that's how I see it playing out. So that's
that's big. That's major.
So go ahead, Vince. Why don't you?
Yeah. So that's going to do it for our. That's going to do it for our quarter breakdown. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, share with your family and friends. Jump on the boards.irishbreakdown.com. There's some good stuff over there. Lots of good information. I'll just put that there. There's a nice update on one of the big recruits for Notre Dame. You want to check that one out. So Ryan's been working overtime. Appreciate that from Ryan. So he got a nice little update there. So make sure you check that out. But make sure you stick around because we got more to come. All right, the next segment that we are going to talk about when we're breaking down the schedule is Brian and I went through and we ranked all 12 opponents. And if my notes here are any indication, as you can see all the crossouts there, is I have changed my rankings multiple times on this one. And so the way we did it, and I want to put this out there, the way we ranked our 1 through 12 is it is toughest game, not necessarily best opponent. And that makes a difference because I would have had a different order up top than I do. Okay, so it's toughest game, not toughest opponent. Now, when I started to get down towards the bottom, it became kind of the strength of the opponent as opposed to the game, because Notre Dame should win those games and it shouldn't be close, like that kind of a thing. So Vince ventured over to the kind of, okay, is it the better team kind of a situation? And so I have made all kinds of alterations.
Yeah, if there's ties, I then go with the better team. Like in my mind, if I'm like having a hard time between the two, I'd go with the better team. Because matter of fact, I had a change on mine during the show as well. It didn't change my overall numbers ranking.
Yeah,
but I had a change as well.
Yeah. So here we go. We're gonna give you our 12 to 1. We're gonna go backwards to the top, and then we'll kind of discuss what we've got going on. So gonna go all 12 teams. Here we go. Ready? Here we go. My number 12 team, Stanford. Maybe a little petty. I don't care. 12 is Stanford. Number 11, Army. Number 10, Navy. Number 9, Northern Illinois. And this was a bit of a movement for me. I had Northern Illinois closer to the bottom. And then I started to do a little bit more research into who Northern Illinois is. And they're projected to be one of the top teams in the MAC, right? And so I moved them up a little bit.
I also reminded you of just assuming that MAC teams and teams like that suck. And we reminded you of the Marshall debacle of 2022 when you had Marshall ranked as your 12th team, and would not, for all the people that say, oh, Vince always changes his mind. Nope.
Not that time.
Hard to get Vince to show Marshall. And he was not budging.
I had a very sour look on my face the entire Marshall Notre Dame game.
Vince, if you'd had Marshall as the number 2 team on your schedule, you'd have still had a very sour look on your face the Marshall game. That was terrible.
That's fair.
Absolutely terrible.
So Northern Illinois is my 9th team. Miami is my number 8 team. Virginia clocks in at number 7. Purdue is number 6. The Fighting Yellow Jackets of Georgia Tech, the Rambling Wreck, they're at number 5. Then I've got Louisville at 4, USC 3, Florida State 2, and Texas A&M is my number 1 team.
So, Vince, I'll give mine. Then you want to talk about it, or do you want to just kind of give some overall thoughts on yours first?
Well, I mean, I could give some overall thoughts, I guess.
Just curious how you want to do it.
There was a drop off at 4 for me at that point. And I will say that Georgia Tech is probably a better team than I want to give them a whole lot of credit for. But I also think we're talking about toughest game.
Yeah.
And I think that's not going to be a tough game for Notre Dame. Like but they're still better than a lot of these other teams. So that's why they clocked in at number 5 for me. Purdue and Virginia were kind of interchangeable at that point. It would not be difficult to convince me to move them down, not up, but down and replacing with maybe some of these other teams. I also moved the 2 MAC schools up higher than I initially gave the service academies a little bit more credit than I probably should have, but then I bopped them down. And again, I've got Stanford in the bottom, and I know that's going to be massively different for you. But you can go ahead and give yours now, because I'm going to write them down as you give them.
Number 1, I'm even seeing the chat. A lot of people are falling in the same trap that you fell into, which is just assuming that because they're in the MAC, they suck. Like, to your point, you point out rightly, like Lindy's has Miami, Ohio number 1 in the MAC, and Northern Illinois 2.
Yeah,
and Toledo 3.
Athlon
has
one
Miami
3.
1, Toledo 2, and then Northern Illinois 3. This is a good football team for a MAC team. That does not mean they should battle Notre Dame or anything like that, but they're better than that. I have Navy last. Again, toughest game, I think, in New Jersey. I think them going away from their option makes that game a lot easier. Army is kind of like is an asterisk. Army's 12 for me if Army goes away from what they used to do.
Yeah.
If Army goes back to what they did the last 4 games of the year, not only are they 11, I might put them up a couple slots higher. But right now, they're number 11 for me. I have Northern Illinois 10, Virginia 9, Stanford 8. I'm back and forth on those two teams a lot, Vince. The reason I have it the way that I do now is because the Virginia game is coming right after Florida State. That's the big one for me. Now, Stanford's coming after Louisville, but as you mentioned earlier, like that's that game where I think Notre Dame's going to kind of have a little bit of something extra for that Stanford game. And where Virginia, it's like that could be a tougher game because you're coming off that high of the Florida State win or the dejection of a Florida State loss.
So who'd you have at 10?
I had Northern Illinois at 10.
Okay.
Yeah. Just because, again, I think Northern Illinois at home early in the season, I think it's going to be Northern Illinois is higher on my list of teams. But as far as toughest game, it being the home opener, they're going to have some new guys there breaking in. Notre Dame's coming off the A&M game. I just think it's going to be a little bit of an easier game than I think maybe some folks will think. Than I think, I shouldn't say folks, because I think most folks have them ranked last. It'll be a little easier game than even I think based on how good the team is, if that makes sense. I have Virginia 9, Stanford 8, Purdue 7. Now, I don't know if Purdue's going to be as good as Stanford, but I actually kind of like some of the additions that Purdue made this offseason. They got Hudson Card coming back at quarterback. I like Hudson Card a lot. I almost ranked Purdue ahead of Miami of Ohio. I really thought long and hard about that. And I'm actually, if I had probably more time to think about this, I might actually move Purdue up a little bit. Just because, the type of offseason they had, getting a lot of players, and they lost some really good football players. That's the problem that they had. They lost some really good football players from their team, but they also got some decent, young, talented, unproven guys in early. So I think the reason I have Purdue where they are, and I'm not going to move them, is because of when they play. And they're only going to have one game. All those new guys are going to have one game, then a bye. Indiana State, then a bye. I think they'd have been better off getting a second game as a team. Like, play somebody in game 2. Like, I'm looking at the rest of their schedule, Vince. Like, if they could have somehow, I guess the rest of their non-conference is Oregon State. But even if at Oregon State, I think it would have helped prepare them better for playing Notre Dame. Just something in between those two games. But Indiana State, then a bye is not going to get them as prepared for that game.
Sure.
So that's why I have Purdue where I have them. But that's a decent team. Miami of Ohio 6. I have Georgia Tech 5. I think Georgia Tech's a talented football team. It's a game Notre Dame should win. I think they could give Notre Dame a much tougher game than you think they could give them, mainly because I think they have a very dynamic quarterback as a runner, and that's always one of my key ingredients to a trap game. It's what we talked about with Riley Leonard last year. You got a quarterback that can make a lot of plays with his legs, and that's always scary when you're coming off of a big game or a big win or it's a big moment. Louisville 4, Texas A&M 3, USC 2. Florida State 1. So we had the same top 4. I think there's a big drop-off from 4 to 5. I think there's a big drop-off from 7 to the next as well, in my opinion, after
That's
Purdue.
fair.
I think there's because you get them at home. And so let's talk about that top group, Vince. We had a lot of similarities. I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time on some of those other teams. I don't know what to make of Stanford, because I really like Troy Taylor as a coach.
Sure.
I look at their roster and I'm like, man, they got some really talented kids. But then I look at their team and I'm like, but they sucked last year. Like, they were really bad. Like, they weren't even like, hey, we had some really good teams that we lost to in competitive games. Like, they looked great against Washington one week in a 10, 11-point loss and then just get murdered by Oregon State the next week. It's just like, it's just such a strange team. And I don't know how much better they're going to be. Lost some guys in the portal, and it's a strange team. They can end up being better. Purdue's a team that I wasn't super comfortable with. That the reason Purdue is that low on my list is because of when they play and the fact that they're just not going to be as I think Purdue's going to give some teams a tougher game in October, November than they're going to give Notre Dame, in my opinion, because they're just going to have more time as a team under their belt. And that's kind of what, because like they play Indiana State, then they play Notre Dame. They got some teams with tough schedules. This is what Purdue's got this year. I kind of feel bad for Ryan Walters. They get Indiana State at home, then a bye. Then they have Notre Dame at Oregon State, home against Nebraska, at Wisconsin, at Illinois, home against Oregon, bye, home against Northwestern, at Ohio State,
Oof.
home against Penn State, at Michigan State, at Indiana. This is a perfect example of what I've always said. I would much rather, if I'm not a very good team or I'm a middle of the road team, I'd rather play the top teams I have no chance against on the road. I would much rather have road games against Oregon and Penn State and get
Notre Dame
and Nebraska and get Michigan State at home, Indiana at home, Illinois at home, and maybe Oregon State at home. They're going to lose to Notre Dame no matter what. But
right,
Notre Dame's the same thing, right? So it's a tough schedule for them. But I could see them maybe pulling a couple upsets later in the year because I do like the additions he made through the portal, and they could be decent. But when you look at the top, Vince, we had the one area where we had the biggest difference is kind of the arrangement of the top three teams because you had A&M 1, Florida State 2, USC 3.
Yep.
I have Florida State 1, USC 2, Texas A&M 3. Let's talk about USC versus A&M real quick because here's why I have USC tougher. Number one, A&M's obviously going to be a louder crowd, a tougher environment, but I'm taking the team that's going into year 3 of this new coaching staff's tenure versus the team that's going into year 1. I think Notre Dame has a tougher roster. I mean, a better roster. I think this is one of those games where Notre Dame has actually played pretty well in openers under Marcus Freeman. Even the Ohio State game 2 years ago, they were ready to play that game. But you and I were there. We're in the press. But I'm like, they were playing hard.
Oh, yeah.
They just got their butts kicked in the trenches.
I didn't think Notre Dame was going to win that game. They gave me hope as I was watching.
Like, yeah, they had a lead late in the third quarter. And then last year they went on the road and were just destroyed Navy. So say what you want. First games of the year for Marcus Freeman, he's got his teams out of the gate quickly and playing well. So I just, and then, Mike Elko's a good football coach. Mike Elko's first game at Duke was a blowout win over Temple. And then their first game of 2023 was a home win over Clemson to start the season off with. So they've started off well too, but Temple's not Notre Dame. And he doesn't have Riley Leonard at quarterback, although I do like Connor Wegman. So and then when I look at USC, Vince, by that point in time, that's now game 12 of the DeAnton Lynn era. You've now got them having 11 games under their belt as a defense, learning that defense. I think their depth is better this year than it was last year. That's something we've seen. USC added a lot of transfers that are going to be depth guys. So, like, we talk about the starters for them. You've got Bear Alexander. You've got I'm trying to remember give me a second. I'm going to pull up. I got USC's depth chart right here. But when you look at their schedule, Vince, they've got, or their depth chart. So I've got they got potentially Anthony Lucas could start there. You've got Jameel Muhammad comes back there. You're also going to have Nate Clifton as a starter there, Bear Alexander as a starter there. And then you look at the rest of USC's depth chart, and there's some guys coming back from injury that missed last year. You've got some other transfers in. They're going to be depth guys. You've got some high school kids that are going to be depth guys. Like, they're going to have just a little bit better depth this year. Their secondary is going to be deeper. They lost some guys, but they had a lot of additions. I think they're going to have a tough day. Like, instead of trying to change the culture on defense, they just simply got rid of the kids that are soft and brought in kids that are tough. You have two defensive backs from UCLA coming in who played in this system. You have two tough kids from Oregon State coming in at middle linebacker and Achille Arnold at safety. So I just think this team's going to be a lot better on defense, and I would have much rather played them early where they've only got 4 or 5 games under their belt and in DeAnton Lynn's system. By game 12, I think they're going to kind of have that thing down. Now, maybe they're beat up and all that, but I just think this is going to be a better USC team than people think. I think that people look at their schedule and their defense and are like, yeah, their defense sucked last year. And it's like, it did. It was pretty terrible. They had bad coaching and bad players. But their entire secondaries basically could be brand new. You got John Humphrey transferred in from UCLA. UCLA was really good defensive football team last year. You got Kamari Ramsey transferring in from UCLA. You got Achille Arnold transferring in from Oregon State. Mason Cobb comes back a linebacker. He's pretty good player, transferred in from Oklahoma State a year ago. He now goes into year 2 there. You've got the other Arnold kid from Oregon State. Their middle linebacker was the first team all Pac-12 linebacker last year. He's now their new middle linebacker. And their 2 best D linemen from last year, they're only 2 good defensive linemen last year. Jameel Muhammad and Bear Alexander are both back. and you finally have a legitimate coaching staff. And then you look at their offensive line, and there's some talented players there. Their receivers are Zechariah Branch goes into year 2. You've got Kyron Hudson, Deuce Robinson. You've got Mekhi Lemon. You've got Kyle Ford transferred in. Jay Fair transferred in from Auburn. Those are backups. Those guys were coming in as starters last year. Jacoby Lane is going to be there. So I just think USC is going to be a better football team than people think. The question is going to be, can they figure out quarterback? That's the big thing for me. Can they figure it out at quarterback? Yeah. Is it the kid from UNLV? Is it Miller Moss? That's going to be the key. But I think they're going to be better on defense. I think their O-line is going to be a little bit better than it was last year. They moved Jonah Monheim to center, which is interesting. But I don't think that's going to affect them as much against Notre Dame as it will early when they're breaking in Elijah Page at tackle. Mason Murphy's kicked out the tackle. He played tackle late last year, but he played mostly guard. You've got a kid coming back from injury that might start at guard, Gino Quinones, and then Emmanuel Pregnon started last year at guard. So you've got some talent there. And Elijah Page is kind of like Charles Jagsaw, highly ranked freshman. Remember, Notre Dame commit. Highly ranked freshman, started the last game of the year, played well in the bowl game, that kind of thing. So I just think they're going to be better than people think. I think their roster is better than people think. And I don't think enough people are – you know what it is, Vince? I don't know if enough people that don't follow college football like super closely like I do, like you do, like Ryan does, really understand how good DeAnton Lynn was last year. Because nobody cared about UCLA. They weren't very good.
Right.
He did a phenomenal job with that defense last year at UCLA. And I think that I just think they're going to be a tougher team. And so it's the timing of when they played, Vince, is really what it comes down to. If A&M was a month and a half later, I'd move them up. But first game of the Elko tenure, Notre Dame's going to be locked in. They're going to be fired up. And then also, Vince, by USC, you've kind of gone through the whole season and you're going to be at your most worn out. You're coming off an option game, all that kind of stuff. That's why I have USC a little bit higher than Texas A&M. That's my take on that.
It's pretty simple for me. It is the environment that you're going into. You talked about that one. It is the fact that it is the first game of the season, and it sets up your entire season. And that's why I have Texas A&M first, because I think that there's more riding on that game with all of the unknowns that still exist for both Texas A&M and Notre Dame. By the time we get to week 12, we're going to know who Notre Dame is. We're also going to know who USC is at that point. And so I'm going to have a much better idea of what to expect from both teams going into that game. I'll also know more about what is on the line for both teams going into that game. So a bit of the reason that I have Texas A&M where I have them is the mystery part of it. It's the question marks part of it. And there's going to be some sort of a surprise. And I don't know if that's going to be a positive one, a negative one. I don't know. But there's going to be some surprises in the Texas A&M game, whether it's on a Notre Dame side, whether it's on the A&M side, or whatever the case may be. There's going to be some surprises. I hate surprises, Brian. I hate them. I don't like them. And it makes that game harder for me.
Yeah.
There's not going to be any surprises in week 12, game 12, as
I
far
get
as
that.
I'm concerned. And so that's why it's a tougher game for me.
I just don't know that there's as many surprises as you think, because it's like you do have track records of these. I mean, you literally just faced Mike Elko last year.
Sure.
You've coached against Jay Bateman recently. You got a ton of – they know Colin Klein. Here's the other thing too, Vince, is remember, Notre Dame's offensive coordinator, or Texas A&M's offensive coordinator is a guy that Notre Dame interviewed for the offensive coordinator 2 years ago. They know him very well. I don't know what surprises he's going to have. So, but then also, as I said, Notre Dame's played well in the openers. Your points are all valid. I think I'm not pushing back. I'm just saying like the monumentalness of the game matters. I don't know that makes the game tougher. Like, yes, the season could in a lot of ways hinge on how you play in that game. Can this team handle 11 weeks of pressure of you can't lose again?
Right. That's what makes me real
nervous.
That's a lot.
But that's not, to me, that doesn't have as much impact on the actual game. Like, I do think it could be the most meaningful game other than Florida State. That's the other one, too. Here's why I have Florida State number one. It's really simple. I think that's by far the best roster they're going to face this year. True. And I know it's at home and all that, but this is the best Florida State is the best team on the schedule. in my opinion. We're talking more about Florida State in the next section, so I don't want to dive too much into that, Vince, because it is one of the key things we're going to talk about. But when it comes down to it, it's just there's such a gap in roster talent, in my opinion, between Florida State and everybody else, that I think that's why I still have it as the toughest game. Even it's the best opponent. Because you've admitted that's the best team on the schedule.
Gosh, it's not close.
No question.
We're talking about
But
roster,
the fact that you'd say
close.
it's not close is why even playing on the road, it's not enough of you're on the road to close the gap completely to where now the other games are tougher. I can't go there. I think your reasoning is sound and solid, but I just can't go there.
That's fine.
I think Florida State is the best team on the schedule by a mile, and I just don't see anybody else having a good enough roster to make playing on the road that meaningful enough to where Florida State's still not the biggest game. And the other thing, too, if you want to talk about meaningfulness, if they do lose the first game, now this is the biggest game of the season as well.
Sure.
So, there's going to be even more pressure on it, which makes it an even tougher game. If you are undefeated and you're going to that game, like you can't afford to lose that game. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on that game too, as well. So that's kind of how I rank my 12. If there's one team, Vince, I'm going to pop this on you. So Vince hates it when I do this, but I love doing it. If there's one team on the schedule that you think you are going to miss on the most, whether you have them too high or you have them too low, who would be the team on your schedule that you're going to look back and say, I should have had that team a lot higher? If I'm going to miss, I feel like I'm going to miss on that team, or that team is too low or is too high for me. I think they're going to be lower. I feel like the light bulb just went off the way you shot up from looking down at the schedule. Who would that be?
Well, I mean, for me, because I think I put them at a petty 12. It's Stanford. I mean, they have the best opportunity to be higher on the list when it's all said and done, because I have them last, right? And so them being better than the service academies, better than, potentially Northern Illinois, maybe Miami, although I would have a hard time with that. It's going to be Stanford has the opportunity to move the most from a bottom up scenario. I think from a top down scenario, and this is strictly, I think, because of their schedule, would be Georgia Tech. I've got them slotted in the number 5 hole right now. And I could see, just because they might be beaten and battered when it's all said and done, and because of the schedule that they have, they may fall. Like, they may not reach 500 because of the schedule. It doesn't mean they're a bad team, but their schedule's brutal. And so they might end up falling down a few slots if we did this. If we rank the teams, at the end of the season, if we revisited this, I could see them moving the most from high to low, and then Stanford from low to high.
What's interesting is I could make a case that I have Stanford too high for the exact reasons you have them at 12. Right? Because I have them at 8, and I could see them actually being as bad as they were last year, and it's at home game. Because again, it's the toughest games, not the worst team. I don't think you're saying Stanford's the worst team.
No,
on the schedule. This is the easiest game.
I just don't know that they're ready to be, they're ready to compete with Notre Dame in that slot.
Couple teams for me, Vince. Army is one that I have a feeling I could end up being wrong on.
In fact, because you've got them
I have them at 12. They went 6-6 last year, but it was an ugly 6-6. Like it wasn't a impressive. Ooh, Army is a tough team, a tough out type of 6-6. I mean, it was. They beat Delaware State. They beat UTSA without their starting quarterback. They beat Air Force, who was super banged up. They beat Holy Cross. They had a nice one over Coastal Carolina, but Coastal struggled last year, and then they beat Navy in a rivalry game. So, I mean, Coastal, a week after losing to Army by a touchdown, they lost by 42 to James Madison. They were not a great team last year either. So I could see Army, especially if they go back to being a traditional option team, could be higher than that. Purdue's another team, as I mentioned, that I think could be higher. The reason I'm not going to budge on Georgia Tech personally, and I think you make sound arguments, is because everything you said that could make them fall down as a team is going to make that a tougher game. Because I look at it, Vince, by the time they play Notre Dame, they will have played Florida State. They will have played at Syracuse. They will have played at Louisville. Then they have a bye. Then the 2 games coming into that game are Duke and at North Carolina. Let's say they lose to Florida State. Let's say they lose to Syracuse. Let's say they lose to Louisville. And then let's say they beat Georgia State, beat VMI, and then they split with Duke and North Carolina. So that would make them 3-4. They've got Notre Dame, at Virginia Tech, home against Miami, home against NC State, at Georgia left on the schedule. They can't afford many more losses.
Right.
I view them as, at that point in time, that they're now desperate. Like, hey, we got nothing to lose. We got Murderers Row coming up on our schedule, and if we don't knock off one of these teams, and here's the other thing too is people talk about, it's Notre Dame's a team Super Bowl. I look at it a little differently. This is the money game. You want to get some big bucks in the portal? You want to get viewed in the NFL draft? You want to get some attention? Go have your best game against Notre Dame.
Sure.
Right? Like, that's the way I look at it. And so that's why I look and say, man, I think this team could look at it and say, hey, listen, we are at this point in time in a must-win situation, which makes them dangerous because they got nothing to lose. That's now they're pulling out reverses and double passes, and it may not work, and you may beat them by 50, but it may work, and you're in trouble.
Sure.
That's kind of where I look at it from that standpoint. So that's why I'm not budging on them, even though I don't think they will end up being the 5th best team from a schedule standpoint because of the schedule is just brutal. Now, to one thing you did say, Vince, about Georgia Tech, if they're beat up by then, no chance. They'll go way down, to your point. If they're injured.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm saying.
But my thing is, I don't know that I think the toughest part of their schedule is from Notre Dame on. And the reason I say that is they do have Florida State in the opener, but then they have Georgia State after that, who's not a bad team. And then Syracuse on the road will be a tough game, but then they're home against VMI. Then they're at Louisville, tough game, and then bye. And then Duke at home, should winnable. North Carolina on the road, who knows how good they'll be. Once they get to Notre Dame, there is not an easy game left. I mean, I could see them legitimately losing their last 6 games. Like, seriously, at North Carolina, home against Notre Dame, at Virginia Tech, home against Miami, home against NC State, at Georgia. It's conceivable they could lose all 6 of those games. And so, like, that's where I think they're going to get beat up. But if you're right and they're beat up already, then Notre Dame will steamroll them. That's just how it'll be. So that's going to be an interesting one. But I am comfortable with my top 3. But I'm not going to sit here and say, like, Vince, dude, you are so wrong for not having – like, there's a case to be made for all of them to be where they are in the top 3.
Sure.
I think Louisville is not in the conversation of being the top 3 for me.
Agreed.
I think their roster's good. They weren't a great team last year. They won because Jeff Brom did a great coaching job and they had some athletes. They're going to have some athletes again this year. I like the Colin Lacey kid they got in the portal. They got a couple other receivers in the portal. They've got some decent running backs. Their offensive line will have 3 or 4 starters back. Tyler Shuck, if he's healthy, he's a solid quarterback. They got some good players on defense. Like, they're going to be a good team. But I didn't think they were that great of a team last year. They just had a great football coach. And now kind of people have an idea, okay, well, what's Brom going to do with this football team? He was a much more balanced coach last year than he was before. And I think in some ways, I think Louisville snuck up on some people last year, Vince. If
I'm being
honest with you.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And like Notre Dame is not going to be facing the same gauntlet of games like they did when they played Louisville last year. I mean, because this is a Louisville team that lost their last 3 games last year, and lost at Pitt. It's like, they're beat Miami by a touchdown, beat Virginia by a touchdown, beat North Carolina State by 3, beat Indiana by a touchdown, beat Georgia Tech by 5 in a game they had to come back from. They were a team that did it. That was a great coaching job by Brom. I don't know that they're going to be that great. And I think the fact that now that you're hopefully going to get a pissed off Notre Dame, I think that's going to be a butt whooping.
Yeah.
It's going to be a butt whooping.
Yep.
But they're a good football team. Don't get me wrong. They're going to be a good football team. I don't think that they were quite as good maybe as their record showed last year. And, we'll see. But then they lost some good players too. They had some good portal additions. They got, their DNs, I think, are both back from last year that kicked freaking Notre Dame's butts. Like the D linemen, like Ryan's talking about in the chat, they're going to have a D line that's going to be good. Yeah, it's going to be good. Not getting Tyler Barron in the portal hurts a little bit. But a lot of the dudes that tore Notre Dame up last year are back on the D line. I just think Notre Dame's going to match up a lot better with the skill that they're going to have on offense, and that's going to be the key. And they're going to have a much better coach. And Notre Dame just peed away so many opportunities in that game to take control of that game. I think you get them at home, Notre Dame's going to be a little ticked off. I could see Louisville not being as tough of a game as maybe a couple teams below them.
Statement game, baby.
That's it. Now they're easily my 3rd or 4th best team on the schedule. That's different. It's toughness of the game. is what I'm referring to here.
All right. That is going to do it for this section of our show today. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell, share with your family and friends, and make sure you jump on the boards at irishbreakdown.com. If you're not there, I mean, you're just missing out. I'm sorry. It's like middle school. If you're not in the group, if you're not in the clique, you're missing out. So, but you can fix that. You just got to go to the group and you got to ask to be in. All right. So stick around. We've got some more coming up. All right, our last section that we are going to be talking about today are storylines of the season. So going into each game, what are the storylines going into each game? And some of them obviously are going to be potential storylines depending on how games previous to that have shaken out, things like that. But we're gonna kind of go pretty much in chronological order, I think, Brian, as far as what the storylines are.
Well, yeah, just kind of, we have that thing and that we went over. I feel like it's just going to be one of those things where just the themes, just kind of order of what we talked about, and it's kind of in order, but kind of not, but it's just the things that we look at and say, what are the big storylines of the season? What are the things that I'm most excited about, or I think we're going to talk about the most from the season, and just kind of have some fun with it, man. Just like you said, I think it looks like that way. It looks like it's chronological because the first one is,
well, that's true,
Mike Elko versus Marcus Freeman.
Yes,
round 2, because you have two of the last 3 Notre Dame coordinators before he was hired, 2 of Brian Kelly's last 3 defensive coordinators, 2 guys that have done very good jobs. They're both going into their 3rd year as head coaches. Obviously, Mike Elko's in a new school. Marcus Freeman's at the same school. 2 great defensive minds. And also the aspect of what are they trying to establish?
Right.
Elko is trying to lay a foundation. Freeman's trying to take that next step. And kind of what the win over each other can do. Like, what can a win for A&M over Notre Dame in game 1 of Mike Elko's tenure? I mean, that's a great way to start off his tenure, Vince. I mean, absolutely. A great way. And then you look at the rest of their schedule, there's a chance they go into late October undefeated. They play McNeese State in game 2. They play at Florida in game 3. I got to think if you're good enough to beat Notre Dame, you're going to beat Florida. Then you get Bowling Green in game 4. They're 4-0 at that point in time if they beat Notre Dame. Then they get Arkansas in Dallas. They get Missouri at home. Then they have a bye week. You're going into a road game at Mississippi State on October 19th, undefeated, 6-0. Maybe you win that game. Then you got LSU at home. It's very winnable, at South Carolina, home against New Mexico State, at Auburn, home against Texas. Like, you beat Notre Dame, you're going on a run, in my opinion.
Sure.
And then what does that do for recruiting? So this is a huge game for A&M. And then for Marcus Freeman, it's like, okay, we're now in year 3. It's now time to start winning these type of games. We're trying to send a statement to the SEC. We came down to play one of your teams. We took them behind the woodshed. We're a title contender. We're going to have that year 3 jump that everybody talks about. This is the game you got to show that. But there's going to be, and then of course game day is going to be there. And then what does that do for Notre Dame's recruiting? This is a team that's a top 5 to 8 recruiting team every year. What's it going to say for that? Notre Dame's trying to get a much bigger impact than the state of Texas. You're going to have a ton of kids in the 26 class that Notre Dame's recruiting. They're going to be at that football game.
Absolutely.
A ton.
Absolutely.
And what is your statement to them? Okay. You don't think A&M's going to try to flip Tanook Hines if he were to commit to Notre Dame? Let's just say, and I don't know if he's going to do that, but let's say he does. You don't think A&M might try to flip him and use that game as evidence? Or when they try to flip him, or when Texas tries to flip him, if Notre Dame got him, that you look back and be like, hey, did you guys see what happened when we went down to Texas and played them Aggies? You know what I mean? Like, nah, you don't want to do all that mess. This is where you need to be. So those are all things that I look at and I say, hey, man, it's like, this is a big game. I mean, this is a big game. And to your point, Vince, as you said it earlier, the story of your season begins to be defined with this game.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas
time.
Like last year, you didn't really know anything about Notre Dame until week 3. Correct. And you really didn't know what kind of team they were until week 5.
Right.
Now, it's like you're going to know week 1 to some degree
Right.
We are going to learn something about this Notre Dame football team to some degree.
Yeah, there's still going to be some growth opportunities, obviously, for Notre Dame after week 1. But this game is such a it sets the precedent for the season. It just does, right? Because if they lose, again, razor thin margin the rest of the way, can Marcus Freeman coach them to 11 straight victories? I mean, that's going to be the question, right? Or is it going to be a win and you kind of, I'm not saying you take a deep breath, but you kind of do, right? Because everything's been leading up to this first game.
Information of who you think you are.
Absolutely. And look, they're not going to be a finished product after game 1. Nobody's saying that. There's going to be issues, right, that we're going to be able to dissect. And that's when you want to tune in on Sunday, because when we're doing upon further review, we're going to kind of dig into it a little bit. But you're going to feel a lot better about yourself if you're Notre Dame and if you're a Notre Dame fan, if they go and they take care of business the way that they should at Texas A&M, hostile environment, all of those different things. And you're going to put some, not all, some of the criticism to bed in one game. I just think that you will. Now, there's going to be obviously there's more road bumps as the schedule wears on and all of those different things. Yes, 100%. But I'm just, everything seems more manageable if you win game 1. Everything just seems more manageable if you win that first one.
You can go to the next one.
Oh, all right.
You nailed it, man. Hey, buddy.
Love it. Okay, beautiful. So our next potential storyline is how good is Florida State and USC going to be this year, and how are they key to the schedule?
Yeah, so to me, Vince, this comes into how is Notre Dame's schedule going to be viewed by the playoff committee?
Yeah.
Right? Like I think A&M's going to be a good team. I laid out their schedule. That's, to me, a minimum 8-win team. That's an 8 to 9 win team. And if they're competitive against Notre Dame, like for A&M, their margin for error in the Notre Dame game is a little wider. They don't actually have to beat Notre Dame, in my opinion, to kind of get some momentum. If they go toe-to-toe with a preseason borderline top 5 team, that's like, hey, man, like, that's kind of where Notre Dame was. Remember the whole, man, we almost beat this really good team. We are pretty good. Let's go out there and show it. Let's take that next step. Notre Dame has to win. A&M just has to play well, even in a loss. Hey, you lost at home by a field goal to a top 5 team that everybody thinks is a playoff team this year. You know what I mean? You can then use that, Vince. So ultimately, but that's not the game you're going to be determined by, because that's August 31st.
Right.
USC and Florida State are both November games. That's going to have a way bigger impact on how you're viewed by the committee. And if Florida State's, 8-4, 9-3, and you pounded them at home, if USC 7-5 and you pounded them on the road, they're going to look at your schedule if you have a loss or two and be like, yeah, but you didn't beat anybody. And so that's a big thing for me. Like, if Notre Dame's an 11-1 team and they lose to one of those teams, they better hope that the other team and A&M and Louisville are all pretty good. Because at the end of the day, the committee has shown, for the most part, they don't care as much about who you lost to. They care about who you beat. And that's going to be the key. Is you say, well, Florida State and USC we know are big names, but it doesn't mean that they're good teams. And Notre Dame needs them to be, to me, 9 to 10 plus win teams. And that's like Notre Dame needs Florida State to be as good as you and I think they're going to be, Vince. 1 to 2 loss team, ACC championship game, that kind of thing.
You've got to have something to hang your hat on with your schedule, right? I mean, you have to, and they're going to bank on obviously winning those games if you're Notre Dame, right? But, you would love nothing more than Florida State to win the ACC championship, or at the very least be in the ACC championship game. And you want USC to be able to navigate that gauntlet of a schedule and come out with more wins than losses. You know what I mean? You have to, because if you don't, the committee, they look at resumes, man. They do. They look at your resume and they see what you've done and what you haven't done. Right. And if those teams aren't as good as they should be, Notre Dame's going to have a hard time. They're going to have a hard time, when it comes to, I'm not saying necessarily making the playoff, but I'm saying seeding is super important. We talked about it in the last segment, right? Would you rather be the number 5 seed playing at home against the worst team in the playoff and then the next round playing the worst conference champion? Or do you want to be the 8-9, realm, hosting maybe an Oregon, for example, or I don't know, a Penn State? I'm just coming up with teams that are going to be towards the top of their league, but not win it, right? Do you want to host an Oregon or a Penn State, or do you want to host?
And then you got to go play
whatever
number 2 seed.
Exactly.
In the second round.
Makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Makes a big difference. And what it's going to be splitting hairs. It is going to be. If you're 11-1 and those teams aren't what they should be, now you're splitting hairs. Well, Notre Dame didn't. Who did they beat? That's that's going to be the conversation. Who did they beat, and who did they lose to? Right. If you're 11-1, because 12-0 takes
who
care
they
of itself.
Going to matter. I mean, look,
absolutely.
We talked about Clemson in 2017. Clemson in 2017 lost a game to a 4-8 football team. Right. I mean, so that's terrible. But how'd they get in? They beat a number 10 Auburn that season. They beat a Virginia Tech team that was a 9-win team that year. Auburn ended up being 10-4 that year. Auburn played because remember in 2017, Auburn beat Georgia in the regular season badly. And then Georgia beat him in the rematch of the SEC title game. That was a really good Auburn team, that Clemson beat that year. They beat a ranked NC State team on the road. They beat that Miami team that pounded Notre Dame at home, that won 10 games that year. Miami was 10-1 when Clemson beat them in the ACC title game. So why did Clemson get in, even though they lost to a 4-8 Syracuse team? Because they had 4 great wins. That's the key. The danger that Notre Dame has with the schedule as the layout that it is, and this is kind of what we go back to, I don't think right now you can make the case that Notre Dame's schedule is soft. It's not hard, but it's not soft. If it becomes soft, it's because these 2 teams aren't good. That's what'll hurt Notre Dame. I don't see any world where Georgia Tech wins 10 games or Stanford goes out to 9 games or Miami of Ohio goes 11-1, wins the MAC, goes 12-1. I don't see that. I don't see any universe where any of the teams below the top 4 are way better than we think.
If you're hanging your hat on a MAC champion and a Miami of Ohio, win on your schedule,
right?
If that's what you're hanging your hat on, the argument's over. That it's not going to work.
But Purdue's another one, Vince. I like what they did in the Port of the Sauce season, but Purdue's got to play at Wisconsin, at Illinois, Oregon at home, at Ohio State, home against Penn State, at Michigan State, at Oregon State, and Notre Dame. The odds of them being some surprise 9-10 win team is slim.
Right, exactly.
So after the top 4, there's no team that's going to shock like Syracuse did in 2018. That's the whole point. I don't know who that team is. Where Syracuse went from 4-8 to 10-win team, almost beat Clemson that year. Remember, that was Trevor Lawrence's first start. Yeah. And Chase Bright, Ryan and I talked about the other day, Chase Bryce has to come off the bench and rally them to a victory. I don't see that team this year. So again, if those 2 teams aren't good, your schedule is going to take a nosedive when it comes to a perception standpoint. So one of the big storylines this year, if you're a Notre Dame fan, you can hate on Florida State all you want. You can hate USC all you want. But just remind yourself, I don't want to hear you crying in November when Notre Dame's not getting love in the polls.
Yeah.
I mean, they're undefeated. Why are they behind a 1-loss SEC team? They ain't beat anybody because Florida State sucked or was down and USC sucks.
Yep.
So all this time you're rooting for Florida State to lose or rooting for USC to lose. Just know that hurts Notre Dame.
Yep.
So one of the big storylines for me is how good is Florida State and how good is USC?
Yep.
And for Florida State, their schedule's not easy, but it's not hard either. For USC, they've got to manage that against a much tougher schedule. Florida State's schedule is got some challenges on it. You obviously have Notre Dame on the road. You play at SMU. You play at Miami. But your other tough games, Georgia Tech in Ireland. You play Clemson at home. That'll be a tough one. North Carolina at home. It's of the top 10 to 12 teams, it's one of the easier schedules, in my opinion.
For sure. There's only 3 ranked teams on that schedule.
They need them to be good. Yeah. They need Florida State to be because I think they play Miami after they play Notre Dame. Let me pull this up real quick.
They do not.
It's 2 weeks before Notre Dame.
Yeah, there it is.
They need them to have no more than 1 loss.
Yes.
And, if you lose to Miami, you better have beaten Clemson. If you lose to Clemson, you better beat Miami.
Right.
Because if they've got one loss coming into that game, they're a top 10 to 12 team. That's good for Notre Dame. And then coming out of the Notre Dame game, their last 2 games are very winnable.
Yep.
They got a bye week, Charleston Southern, and Florida.
Yes.
At home. Florida at home.
And then the ACC championship game, which they should be a part of.
If they're undefeated or one loss coming into that Notre Dame game and Notre Dame beats them, they're going to be ranked high, and it's going to look good on your resume. USC is a little bit of a trickier situation, Vince, because their schedule is tough. A lot tougher. Yeah, a lot tougher. But it's not crazy. Like, people make it out to be like it's crazy. It's not crazy. They don't play Oregon and they don't play Ohio State. So there's a lot being made about how hard their schedule is. Okay, LSU on a neutral field, that should be a tough game, but I think USC can win that game. Utah State at home, bye week at Michigan. The at Michigan game is going to tell us a lot about USC.
I think it'll tell us a lot about Michigan too. But
very true, very true. But I think it's a winnable game. Sure. And if USC is good, like, here's the thing: if USC is good, that's a winnable game.
Absolutely.
If they're not good, they'll lose. And that's true for a lot of these games. So you go down, then they get Wisconsin at home. If USC's good, they'll win that game. They play at Minnesota. If they're good, they'll win that game. Then they get Penn State at home. That's a tough game. But if they're good, they should win that game. At Maryland, win. Should be a win if they're good. Rutgers at home should be a win. At Washington, I mean, they battled Washington last year, Vince, and Washington was way better than they're going to be this year.
Yeah.
In my opinion. Like, I mean, they went toe-to-toe with Washington last year, lost 52-42. They competed with Washington in that game. Their defense is going to be way better than it is now, in my opinion. So I just look at it, man, and I'm like, I feel as if we're acting like USC's got this gauntlet schedule like Georgia, and it is tough.
Sure.
But at Washington isn't as tough this year as it was last year. Bye week, Nebraska at home, at UCLA. I don't think UCLA is going to be very good. I could see a scenario where USC's 9-2, 8-3 coming into that game and probably ranked in the top 25. That's good for Notre Dame. It's better if they're 9-2, because if they're 9-2 against that schedule, they beat at least one of Washington, Michigan, LSU. Actually, they would have to. So if they're 9-2 coming in that game, LSU was Michigan, Wisconsin, Penn State, Washington, Nebraska. They will have had to win 4 of those 6 games. That's a top 25 team. That's a statement win for Notre Dame. So Notre Dame needs those teams to be good. They don't have to be number 1 undefeated. If they are, that's great. But imagine Notre Dame playing on November 9th at home against an undefeated Florida State and an undefeated Notre Dame. Like, that is going to be a monster game.
Yep.
Probably 2 top 5 teams. Monster game. And, that's a statement win in November. If USC's 9-2, they're a top 12 to 15 team.
Still a statement game in November.
Another statement game. So they really need those. So a big storyline for me is I am absolutely, whatever you think about USC from a rivalry, here's my deal. I love Notre Dame more than I hate USC. I love Notre Dame more than I hate Michigan. If it comes down to it and I need Michigan to win to make it better for Notre Dame when Notre Dame beats them, go blue. You know what I mean? Like, you need that. And that's how I feel about USC. I actually, like I said, I respect USC, but even if you hate USC, it's good for Notre Dame if they win.
Sure.
And then Notre Dame can end their season and smack them.
Yep.
And that's even sweeter. So that's kind of where I come down to it on there's like a bunch of shots. Don't ever say that again.
Yeah, I mean, I can't get on board.
But you get the point, though.
I totally get the point.
It's good for Notre Dame.
I will sit there mute.
And so that's a big storyline for me are those 2 teams. And here's the other thing too is Vince is what's the there's this guy in the chat that's driving me nuts because he's just trolling to this point in time.
Negative.
But the one thing he said that is true is Notre Dame hasn't proven that they can win the big games. Well, we've said that. Now, you saying that and then predict them to lose to Army that's why you're trolling because You're saying some silliness.
Right? Because
they have won big games. Marcus Freeman has won big games. The USC game last year was a big game. Clemson 2 years ago was in November a top 5 team. It's a big game. Can they do it consistently?
Right.
That's the question.
Correct.
And if those teams aren't good, then we still don't know the answer to that going into the playoff.
And can they do it in the postseason? Like that's
we don't know going into the playoff.
Right.
Like, have they been challenged enough now? Have you been challenged enough to go beat those top teams if Florida State and USC aren't good? The last time you played a really good team is August 31st. So for so many reasons, Vince, it's imperative that they be good, in my opinion, that those two teams be good. It's good for Notre Dame if those two teams are good.
So this next storyline kind of piggybacks off of the one that we just talked about. And this is the first time that Notre Dame has played a good Florida State team since 2014. How will they stack up?
I mean, look, it comes down to this, Vince. This is kind of the point that I've made about Florida State, right? Notre Dame is dominating this series recently. I mean, they just have. I believe it's now Florida State leads the all-time series 6-5. Notre Dame has won the last 3 games, 41-38, 42-26, 42-13. The 2 games at home, so they've scored over 40 points each game. The last 2 games at home, Notre Dame dominated. But Florida State in 2021 was not very good. I think they finished that year 5-7, I believe, is what Florida State finished in 2021 when Notre Dame took them to overtime. In 2018, Notre Dame finished 5-7. And then what did I say the other one was? 2020. And in 2020, they finished 3-6. Notre Dame has not beaten a ranked Florida State team in a very long time, Vince. A very long time. Matter of fact, the last time Notre Dame beat a Florida State team with a winning record was 2002.
Oh, wow.
That's it. Because they lost in 2003. They lost in 2011 in a bowl game. They lost in 2014. Now, they've been competitive in those 2 losses, but I don't care about competitive. This is the first time you get to play a Florida State team where Florida State fans can't rightfully say, yeah, but we suck. And Notre Dame was good in all of those seasons. Notre Dame was in the playoff in 2018 when they stomped Florida State. They were a playoff team in 2020 when they stomped Florida State. And they were an 11-1 team that played in the Fiesta Bowl when they beat Florida State in 2021. None of those Florida State teams had a winning record. So you've got to prove yourself that, yes, you've proven you can beat Florida State. But can you beat them when they're good?
When they're good, yeah.
That's the question. And they haven't done that. And so that's why, like you said, they need Florida State to be good.
Sure.
But then they need to win that game. That's the other thing. It's like, okay, they're good, but then they wouldn't beat you. So be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
They were pretty good, but, they went out and beat you. So to me, that's why I think that's a huge game. And that's very important as to why I think that this football team needs Florida State to be good, but then they need that statement win that, hey, we played a top 10 team and we handled our business. And then that's going to help recruiting in the state of the Florida in the South. Big time.
Yeah, because you're right. Because the last 20 years, when they play Florida State, it's all, remember 93, like that whole mantra. You know what I mean? And it was, okay, 93 was great. I was 12. Let's go beat the Florida State as they are right now in this incarnation. You know what I mean? Like that, it just, okay, cool. They've got the tomahawk on the side of the helmet. It's Florida State, but it's not Florida State. Like, come on, guys. So you're right. They need to be better. They absolutely need to be better for this game to actually mean something. And I'm really hoping that it means something this time around. And I think it will. I do. I think it will. I think this is going to be a game that Notre Dame is going to be able to look back on when they win this game at the end of the season. They'll be like, we did that in November. Like, show, put some respect on our name.
This is why we're the 5 seed.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And if they do have a loss, if they lose to a Louisville, if they lose to a Texas A&M, if they get upset by a Georgia Tech for whatever reason, this is the kind of game that vaults them back up in that standing.
Absolutely.
That's the
reality
of it.
It is, but where it's located in the schedule is super important to me because there's that 11 in front of it. It's a November game. Those are the ones. Not that A&M doesn't matter. I had it at number 1, and that game matters. But this game matters because of where it's located. They got to win these games in November. You've got to remember, early on in Brian Kelly's tenure, probably pre-2016, they just weren't good in November, and that was a storyline that
You mean pre-Matt Bayless?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly. It was, man, they just can't win games in November. They can't win the games in November. Then Matt Bayless showed up, and it was like, they can't lose games in November.
And even the year that they went undefeated in November, Vince, in 2012, all those teams sucked.
Yeah.
Like, none of those teams were good because they had beat Oklahoma at the end of October, and then they came out and they beat a 6-7 Pitt team and by 3. They had to come back from down 2 touchdowns. Remember that? Boston College was 2-10. Wake Forest was 5-7, and then USC was 7-6. And they only beat them by 9. None of those teams were good.
Yeah.
In 2015, Notre Dame had a good record in November. They lost at the end of the year to a really, really good Stanford team, but they barely beat a really bad, if you remember, they barely beat a really bad BC team, which that dropped. Like, people talk, well, they dropped out of the top 4 after they lost Stanford. No, they dropped out of the top 4 after they had that ugly 5 turnover, 3 of them in the red zone win over a 3-9 Boston College team. Right? Like, that's why you lost that game. Or lost the top 4. And then they won by 21, 28-7, but they played poorly against a Wake Forest team that went 3-9. They beat a Pitt team that was 8-5. That was a nice win, but like, even when they were good, to your point, even when they were good, they weren't good in November.
Yeah.
Like, the best they probably ever played in November was Brian Kelly's first year. Remember when they beat Utah and they beat Army? But even then, it's like, were any of those teams really that good outside of Utah?
Right.
So you're gonna have to be good in November, and that's a storyline we didn't have on there, Vince. But you're gonna have to be good in November.
Absolutely.
This is going to be one of your toughest November slates in a long time. If those two teams if our second storyline proves to be fruitful.
Absolutely.
So that's a big one. It's a big
one.
All
right. So our next storyline is going to be
kind of in line, right?
Yeah.
Still kind of in line.
Yeah. That's what we do. So this is round 3 versus DJ Uiagalelei and his second team, obviously, that he's bringing to Notre Dame Stadium. He's 0-2, played really well in game 1, didn't play so hot in game 2. What are you going to get in game 3 from DJ? And I think when we're talking about DJ specifically, we can do a whole show on him and the expectations for him at Florida State, and what he did when he left Clemson and what he did at Clemson, all of those different things. But it's funny because you and I have had this conversation many times about the pressure of being the starter and the pressure of being a backup. When he balled out at Notre Dame, he started that game, but he was not the starter.
He was a true freshman that took Notre Dame, a playoff Notre Dame team, to overtime.
Yeah.
And threw over 400 yards in that game.
Balled out in that game, but he wasn't the starter. You know what I mean? Right. Like, he was filling in. Yeah. He was filling in for Trevor Lawrence, who was there in street clothes, and no pressure. Just go out there and play. He comes back 2 years later. Now, granted, different Notre Dame team. Now you're entrenched as the starter. Didn't play so hot. Right. So I think there's a little bit of that, like starter pressure and coming off the bench, aka backup pressure.
Yeah.
Those are two different things. And so now you've got another DJ coming in, and this is his 3rd time to Notre Dame Stadium. He's been successful here as an individual. He's been not successful here as an individual, never won as a team. What does he bring with this Florida State team that he's bringing into Notre Dame Stadium? That's going to be a very interesting storyline going into this game.
I think DJ was way overhyped coming out of high school, and now I think he's a little underrated. I'm just going to be honest with you. Like, yes, he played poorly against Notre Dame, and Benjamin Morrison ate him up, and the pass rush ate him up. And that kind of rocked him the rest of the year. He didn't recover well from that. He didn't play great against Louisville. He didn't play, he was good against Miami, didn't play well against South Carolina, and then his career is basically over. Like, that was the beginning of the end for him. But, 2 weeks before that, Vince, he took them on the road and beat a 10-win Florida State team, and he passed for 3 touchdowns in that game against Florida State. So people forget too, that was a November game. They were undefeated. They were a top 5 team. They won the ACC that year. So it's like, he was never as good as people made him out to be, but he was also never as bad as people are making him out to be now. And that Oregon State team, I mean, he did some nice things at Oregon State last year. The thing that Jonathan Smith did well is Jonathan Smith said, hey, I can't ask this kid to carry my team. I can't. It's not fair. He's not that kind of quarterback. I know his ranking was such and such, but he's just not that. He's not a carry your team kind of guy. He is a we need to have him be a good leader, make some plays with your legs, throw the ball down the field. And I think there's a lack of structure to the Florida State offense that's going to be good for him. Jordan Travis would dominate a game and go 12 of 27.
Yeah.
It was just a little bit more open, and you can live with some of those mistakes that DJ is going to make, in my opinion. And so that's where I feel as though it's like this kind of, are you going to get the kid that ripped Notre Dame up in 2020? I don't think so. He's never been that kid since then. I mean, if you remember, because we forget that was not his first start. He played very well against Boston College the week before. Him and Phil Dracovic had a great duel in a game that Clemson won by 6. It's a great duel. And he passed for 439 yards against Notre Dame. I'm looking at his schedule, Vince, or his stats, Vince, in the 3 years since. So he passed for his first career start, he passed for 342 yards and 2 touchdowns. His second career start on the road against a playoff team, he passed for 439 yards and 2 touchdowns. Since then, as a full-time starter in 2021, as a full-time starter in 2022, and as a full-time starter in 2023, he has had 1 game of over 300 yards. That's it. He was never that guy. Right. And all that did was put all the hype that was already on him as a 5-star grew through the roof.
Yeah.
To where after that year, they're going to be fine at quarterback without Trevor Lawrence because they've got DJ. And it's like, really?
Well, and that fan base was already, I don't want to say spoiled, but they had a pretty good succession program going at quarterback.
And here's the thing too, Vince, people forget it wasn't just Trevor and Deshaun. I mean, Taj Boyd was really good at Clemson. Charlie Whitehurst was not a bad quarterback. And then you go back to the Rich Rod era with Woody Dantzler. He was a first 1,000 quarterback in college football history. First guy to rush and pass for over 1,000. No, hold on. He was, I think, the first guy to rush for over 1,000 and throw for over 2,000 in college football history. So Clemson's had some quarterbacks. They're a tad spoiled at quarterback with that type of guy, and they thought DJ was going to be that next guy, and he was a bad fit for that system. He goes to Oregon State, and that pressure's off of him. Dude, we're a running football team with a great defense, and I don't think Florida State's going to ask him to be as much as what he was at Clemson. Now, but he's got to play better than he did 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing is, what version of him do you get? And at the end of the day, the one thing's been true is when he doesn't get pressured by the defense, he plays well.
Sure.
When he does get pressured by the defense, he does not play well.
And that's going to be – I mean, look, we're going to break down that game, obviously, leading up to it, and we're going to talk about all the matchups and everything. But, on that side of the football, that's what it's going to come down to. Can they get him off platform? If they get DJ off platform, this is a win for Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. It really is that simple to me. Because if you let him throw from a clean pocket, he's going to rip you apart. Because he's good enough quarterback to do that. But if you can put pressure on him and show him some exotic stuff and really, if you can get pressure with 4 and drop and do all these different things, if you can do that, he's gonna struggle. He's gonna struggle. He'll make some plays, but he's not a mobile guy who's gonna really hurt you with his feet.
Like he's a good runner, but he's not shifty.
Right.
He's physical and he's got some speed for that size, but he's not a make a bunch of guys miss in the pocket kind of guy.
Right.
But even beyond that, he just doesn't handle it well.
Correct. When the bullets are flying.
Mentally, he doesn't handle it well when there's a lot of pressure on him.
And that's what they did to him last time he was here at Notre Dame. And so, I'm looking forward to it. I can tell you that much because it does kind of play into Notre Dame's hands.
Because he'll ultimately be the key to how good Florida State's going to be this year.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. 100%. I wonder, though, as I'm looking at their schedule, how many defenses are going to be able to do that with consistency.
Clemson. And maybe Miami.
Right.
Maybe.
So
I actually like DJ. I think he's a good kid. He strikes me as a good teammate.
I agree.
I want him to be successful.
I think comes from a good family, from what I can tell. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I don't want to piss off Big Dave. You know what I mean? So
No.
I mean, in all seriousness, though, he seems like a good kid, and I just think he had too much put on him early on.
Yes, I agree.
And there was no way he's going to be able to live up to the worst thing he could do was play as well as he did his first 2 starts.
The hype train just left the station at that point. I mean, if he was going to come in and be just a first-year starter without having those 2 starts under his belt, I think it would have been a lot different because I think the expectations would have been tempered a little bit.
Yeah.
But remember, Clemson was flying pretty high at that point too. And so the expectations still would have been high, but maybe not quite as high. So
the next one, Vince, we kind of already talked about in the beginning. It's how will Notre Dame and USC have something on the line?
Sure.
And the point being, like, they haven't played a lot of games where there's something on the line for both teams.
Correct.
That's where this storyline comes from, because in 2023, USC had something on the line and Notre Dame had something on the line, and Notre Dame played very well. In 2022, USC had something on the line. Notre Dame didn't, other than just pride and bowl placement and all that. But Notre Dame already had 3 losses. They weren't playing for anything. 2021, USC wasn't playing for anything. They weren't that good. 2019, Notre Dame was pretty good. USC wasn't. 2018, Notre Dame was really good. USC wasn't. Then the last time they played and there was something on the line, 2017, Notre Dame smacked them. 2016, Notre Dame season was over by that point in time. 2015, I think it was like an 8-6 USC team. 2014, Notre Dame had quit by that point in time. Their season was also that was the end of. They were beat up. That was huge props to Steve Sarkisian. He could have hung 70 on Notre Dame that game if he wanted to, and he called off the dogs. And then Brian Kelly repaid that in 2017 because Chip Long wanted a couple more touchdowns, and Brian Kelly was like, "Run the ball." You remember that when he threw the flea flicker when they were up like 34-14, and Kelly was like, you know what I mean? Like he remembered. Chip wasn't here in 2014. Kelly remembered, in my opinion, what Sark did in 2014. He could have really embarrassed Notre Dame. Remember they went on like that 20-plus play drive that took like almost the whole fourth quarter? Yeah. He could have hung 3 more touchdowns on the board if he wanted to in that fourth quarter. And so I've always kind of had a little bit of a respect for Sark. Like, that's a game you could have really embarrassed your rival.
Sure.
And he's like, look, 49-14 is enough. You know what I mean? But they just haven't had a lot of games where there's a lot on the line for both teams. It has not happened at USC since 2006. I mean, think about that, because every time they've played at USC, one of them has not been very good.
Sure.
And so that's something. It's been a long time. Actually, I'm going to go back and look at this, Vince. I wanted to know when the last time Notre Dame and USC played at the Coliseum when they were both ranked. I bet you it's been a while. And I'm going to see if I can find it here. So, see, Notre Dame. So let's find out. 2012, they were not both ranked. 09, 08, 07, 06 was the last time that Notre Dame and USC played when in US at the Coliseum when they were both ranked. That's the last time that happened. So it's like literally the last time a game in the Coliseum mattered for both teams.
Wow.
Brady Quinn and I think was it Matt Leinart, the quarterback on that team too?
Yeah,
Brady Quinn and Matt Leinart were both still in college, I believe. So yeah, it's been a minute. It's been a minute. So that's going to be an interesting storyline.
Yes, and then of course, I mean,
wait a minute, hold on. Notre Dame wasn't ranked last year when they played, were they? In 2022? Actually, let me look at that. I don't think Notre Dame was ranked when they played. They might have actually just cropped into the top. Actually, they were ranked when they played in 2022. So it'd be the last time they were both ranked in the top 10. Because in 2022, Notre Dame was 15th and USC was 6th.
Okay.
But Notre Dame already had 3 losses. Or 3 losses, yeah. And that was their 4th loss. So, yes, 23. But the last time they were both ranked in the top 10 was 2006.
It's a long time ago.
Long time.
So our next storyline is one we've kind of already touched on as well, but it's revenge versus Louisville.
Yes. This is a big one because, Vince, this is going to tell me a little something about this football team.
Absolutely.
Look, I understand, and I'm all about Marcus Freeman's you have to play one game at a time. Every football coach on the planet has to have that mindset. You can't have your players looking forward. Having said that, I do think the great teams, the teams with that edge, still don't focus on just that game. You don't think the Notre Dame players, the Notre Dame players from back in the 88 have said that. We remembered all the butt whoopings that Miami put on us. We remembered all of them. And then they were all kind of fuel to us going out playing that game. Now, it's still about the week of preparation. And I was talking to a buddy yesterday. I said, look, pregame speeches are very overrated when it comes to they can fire you up, but the first time you get punched in the mouth, that's kind of out of there. Notre Dame didn't beat Miami in 1988 because Lou Holtz gave a great speech. It might have fired them up coming out of the tunnel.
Sure.
They won that game because of a great week of preparation and then executing the game plan. That's why they won that game, because they were just the better team that day, not because of Lou Holtz's speech, right? It was the preparation that went into the game. And so when I look at this, like those things, it's still about the execution. But if you can have a little extra something inside of there, because like, why did that pregame speech kind of fire them up? It was because of the history. The fight happened because of the history. It was, you keep trying to punk us. You punked us last year. You punked us the year before. You're not coming to our stadium and running through our group. You're not doing it. You're not doing it. And so I want to see that this team has a little P&V in them. And it's exactly what we talked about Ohio State in 22, Vince. Like, I thought Ohio State was going to be fired up about, Michigan kicked your butt the year before. Then they talked trash about you the entire calendar year. And you went out in that next game that next year and you were just like, just another game. Go through the motions. I want to see that this Notre Dame team has not forgotten about last year's game when they played Louisville. Like, that's going to tell me something. Just beating Clemson, just beating Louisville, you should beat Louisville at home. I want to see them kind of have a little bit of, like, I'm not going to lie to you, I want to see them kind of trash talking a little bit and then backing it up.
Sure.
I want to maybe see Marcus Freeman let Mike Denbrock put a couple extra in the end zone in the second half of that game, if they can. Like, Al Golden, like, I want to see Al Golden in the third quarter. They don't get another yard. If they get past the line of scrimmage, I'm taking all of you out. You know what I mean? Like, I want to see a little bit of that in that game, because they took your soul a little bit last year. You got to regain that. You got to get that back. And so that's something to where it's like, okay, like, where are you at with this? Where's your head at? Where's your pride at? Because any competitor can say, like, hey, I'm not worried about what happened last year. When you lose, you are.
Yeah, heck yeah.
Yeah, when you lose, you are.
No, you can't. I'm sorry, you can't say that. Last year doesn't matter, especially these guys that started and were on the field for that. Anybody that says that is lying to you. I don't care, or they're not a competitor, and if you're not a competitor, I don't want you on my team anyway. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's a bunch of malarkey to keep it family friendly.
Yep.
Our final storyline that we're going to talk about today: can Notre Dame reignite its ACC dominance since they dropped 2 last year and almost lost another to Duke?
Yeah, because it was like what, 29, something like that.
20, it was a ridiculous number in a row that they had won.
Regular season games that they had won,
right?
Including that two wins over Clemson, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you beat them in 2020.
You had one loss in the playoff, but you had 2 in the regular season.
Well, you had 2 losses to Clemson. You had in the playoff, and then you also had the game against the ACC title game.
Right.
It was like regular season games. The last time you lost an ACC game at home, like in the regular season, was back in 2017 to Miami. And then you come in last year, and of course, all the ACC teams make a big deal out of this. You've kind of dominated that league, and I went back and looked, Vince, and the average margin of victory in those games was double digits. Like, wow. It wasn't even that they were just winning; they were winning, like, in most games, kind of convincingly. And then you go out last year, and you have a very big double-digit win at NC State, where it was closer than the final score, but you were clearly the better team.
Yeah,
that whole day, you never trailed. You were clearly the better team. And then you go out there and you almost lose to Duke. You need a bit of some breaks. Then you go get embarrassed on the road against Louisville, double-digit loss. You bounce back with a blowout win over Pitt, who stinks, and then you go out again and you get smacked in the mouth by Clemson. Yeah, okay, great. You beat a bad Wake Forest team at home. But when Notre Dame played the last 3 games of the ACC schedule last year against good teams, they lost twice and should have lost another. And so, yeah, they were all on the road, but there's a lot of road games that Notre Dame played from after the Miami game that they won. And so, to me, you have to – because when you start talking about seeding, Vince, let's say Florida State and Clemson are both really good. And let's say Florida State beats Clemson and gets the ACC title. They're 12-1. Clemson's sitting there at 11-1. Notre Dame's sitting there at 11-1. Their loss isn't to it. Let's say they lose to A&M early in the season, something like that. You need to look like, hey, we dominated the ACC, because that could be the difference between who gets the 5 seed and who gets the 6 seed.
It's just the hair splitting that we talked about earlier. you've got to have stuff to hang your hat on. And while you're not in a conference, and I'm not in any way advocating that they should be, you still have to take care of common opponents. And whether they're actual common opponents or not, they at least have opponents that are in common.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's where the ACC thing comes into play.
It's just got to look, who's the best team in the ACC?
Yeah.
Well, okay, it's Notre Dame. Yeah, I know Florida State won the ACC title, but did you see what Notre Dame did to them in November?
Exactly.
Right, like it's got to be that. Because that could be, like you said, Vince. It's the perception of where you are that could impact where you're seated. Because like if Notre Dame dominates the ACC, they're most likely a playoff team.
Yeah.
But where are they? 5? Are they 7? Are they 9? Are they 11? That could come down to your perception. And no, the ACC is not a great conference, which is exactly why you need to dominate it. And that's the key. And so that's going to be a final storyline. And you're going to have, and the thing is, Vince, you're getting 2 of the best teams in that league this year. So it's not going to be like some years you don't get really good ACC teams. It just plays out that way.
Sure.
But this year you're getting the best preseason ACC, the defending ACC champs, preseason top 15 team. You're getting Louisville, who beat you last year, top 25 team.
I'm so glad you're on the schedule.
And you're getting 2 of the best in the league. So now's your chance to say, hey, look, you got to come to our place now. And it's not going to go as well for you as it did last year when we had to go to your place.
Right.
So they're going to have to reestablish dominance in that league, in my opinion, Vince. And the next couple of years needs to get back to doing that. And this year's a great chance because you get to take on the big dog. And especially if Florida State beats Clemson, and now you then go handle business against Florida State, now it really looks good.
Opponent of an opponent. I mean, that's exactly what you want. And that's, again, if your scenario is accurate and it's an 11-1 Clemson team and an 11-1 Notre Dame team, and Clemson lost to Florida State, Notre Dame beat Florida State.
Yeah.
Because
then what would happen if they would have a win over Georgia? Or let's say that, Clemson beats Florida State and loses to Georgia. They're 11-1. They play in a rematch, and then Florida State wins the rematch. But if let's say they don't play in a rematch, but then Clemson beat Florida State by a field goal, Notre Dame beat them by 25. You know what I mean? Like that's the kind of thing that starts mattering. Yes. And you say, well, the transitive property doesn't matter, but when you're putting a ranking together, that's all you have to go by.
It has to matter.
That's all you have to go by.
Yeah, right.
Right.
It's a data point that matters, for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
So those are the storylines that we have as we sit here. Oh, go ahead.
We had a super chat that I wanted
I didn't know that. Okay, cool.
It's kind of a storyline related thing, so I kind of wanted to bring that up before we get to that.
All right, Rob Osgood, thank you so much for the super chat. Hey, guys, I know we talked about this before, but remind me, with the playoff this year, how would you deal with load management, or if at all?
I don't think you can ignore it, but I also don't like the idea of load management because when I think load management, I think of the NBA.
Right.
You sit guys for games, that's not what I want. What I want is, number one, in the non-big games, be willing to go a little deeper into your depth chart early.
Yes. Yep.
During the week of practice and during, especially as you get into October, November. So, do I say rest your starters against Virginia? Heck no. But do you maybe give your backups does Howard Cross really need max reps on Tuesday and Wednesday of that game? And so when you're blowing a team out, it's okay for Howard Cross only played 15 snaps in a game where you beat a team by 60, right? Because you're going to need him to play 60 when you play Florida State.
Yeah, absolutely.
So those type of things. So, and people say, well, you take 10 snaps off a game per guy. That's fine. But it's also about the number of reps you're taking Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Yes.
And so you've got to be,
we don't see.
Right. You've got to be smart about, you have to make sure your team is incredibly prepared. But that's why in practice, I may not only have a 4 or 5 man rotation with my ones during the week of practice at receiver. I may go 6 or 7. Just take a little bit of that off, especially as you kind of get into the season. So that's kind of where I'm at. And then first chance you're blowing a team out, put your backup quarterback in. Don't take a chance of getting Riley Leonard hurt.
Right.
But I'm not putting too much. So it's more of thinking long term. I'm not sitting starters.
No.
I'm not, any of that stuff, because again, you're jockeying for position. But the reality is Notre Dame's last game of the season this year is on November 30th.
Correct.
There's, I believe, 31 days in November. Correct?
No, 30.
There's only 30.
Yeah.
Your first playoff game's the 20th. That's one game, and then the next 3 games are on the 21st. You have 3 weeks off after the USC game. That's where you rest.
Yep.
So, yes, I want to have some sense of be smart. You don't need to play Howard Cross 45 snaps against Northern Illinois. You don't need to play Xavier Watts 70 snaps against Purdue unless it's a close game, but that's why you go handle your business.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't need Riley Mills to play 50 snaps against Navy. You know what I mean? And then that's the other thing too, Vince. The one load management game thing I would have where I'm really even being more mindful of my defensive linemen and linebackers is the Navy and Army games if they're still running the traditional option.
Yeah, good
I am playing 10 defensive linemen against Army the week before USC. 10. I'm playing 6 interior guys, and I'm playing at least 10. I may play 12. I may have just 3 waves I'm throwing at Army in that game because I'm not going to have Howard Cross have to play 60 snaps against Army. I'm not. And so it's stuff like that, but it's still with the intent of we're going to win this game. We're going to win this game and blow this team out. And so if Howard only plays 20 snaps against Miami of Ohio, it's not because you had a 4-man rotation in the first quarter. It's because, yes, you have a rotation, but you put that team away, and now I'm not playing him in the second half because he doesn't need to play in the third quarter against Miami of Ohio. I need to get – right.
Yeah, with as many games as the eventual national champion is going to have to play this year, right, with the expanded playoff and all of those different things. I don't like the term load management, but the way that a coaching staff deals with
you have to use your depth.
Yes, absolutely.
You have to use your depth.
The way they deal with that from game 1 all the way to game 17 or whatever number it ends up being is going to have an advantage. They're going to have an advantage on how the coaching staff deals with that. And again, I'm not saying to sit players and not play them in certain games like that. No, absolutely. That's why I don't like the term load management. Yes. And Notre Dame's roster, if we're talking now about Notre Dame specifically, Notre Dame has a deep roster.
Right.
They can go deep in their roster and take some of those snaps away, both in practice and in games, to have guys fresher when it comes to December. They absolutely have that. And you have to take advantage of that. And so the coaching staff that does that the best is going to have an advantage in the playoff and as they advance through the playoff. There's no doubt in my mind. No doubt.
Right. I mean, when you go through the season, Vince, it's you have to be smart about what games are like, look, guys, we're going to smack this team. Now, that doesn't mean you do what Brian Kelly did in 2018 against Ball State, where you just play you're having on Tuesday, your third stringers are getting a bunch of reps. No, have a normal Tuesday practice, pull back a little bit on Wednesday, and just and like I said, if I'm normally a 4-man defensive tackle rotation in that Northern Illinois game, I'm going to get my 5th, 6th guy queued up a little bit early.
Sure.
That may be a game where I don't really care that RJ Oben plays much past the second quarter. I'm going to get Bryce Young a little bit more work. I'm going to get, that's a game where I don't need to play Jack Kaiser 60 snaps. I'm going to get Kingston a lot more work. I'm going to get Jalen Sneed or Jaden Alsbury a lot more work. I need to get Luke Talich in that game, and I need to get Adon Schuler in that game, and I don't need Xavier Watts to have 15 tackles against Northern Illinois. And so those are the things I look at and say, that's where I'm talking about. It's not sitting anybody. It's just use your rotation more. Yes. Because it's easier to kind of ramp it up against Texas A&M and then Louisville and then Florida State and then things like that. That's the key, Vince. And so, yeah, I'm not a big fan of load management because I think that just gives me NBA vibes, and I hate it.
And it's like, oh, we're going to sit them for these 2 games or what? Like, no.
Got to make sure, though, however, that you're being smart. So let's say you've got the talent, use it.
Yes, exactly.
Use it.
Yes. We talk about the depth all the time at Notre Dame. Use it.
If you can't beat Northern Illinois by 40 with Cam Williams playing maybe 10 more snaps than he otherwise would.
Right.
Or with Jason Onye getting 10, 15 more snaps than he normally would, or whatever the case may be, then you know what? You're not a very good football team. That's the key.
Right.
So,
all right. Well, that's going to
– Thanks for the super chat, man. Appreciate
That's great, Rob. Appreciate you very much. That's going to do it for this edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, share with your family and friends. Now is the time to jump on the boards, too. boards.irishbreakdown.com. All kinds of intel in there. We got official visits happening. There's stuff going on, people, and there's always stuff going on. And you're not going to know about it first if you're not on the boards. You'll know about it eventually. But if you want to be the person that's giving the information to people,
no, don't give people information unless they're on the boards. Keep that on the boards.
All right, you're right.
Come on now.
Dang it.
But if you want to be in the know, if you want to be in the know,
right,
which people like, then you need to be a premium member at boards.irishbreakdown.com.
Correct.
Ryan had a little intel piece on Ivan Taylor on the message board.
I mentioned that last time. Yes, I mentioned that last time. So make sure you check it out. Ryan's still putting in work over at IB, which we love. And so check it out. But that's going to do it for today. Make sure you check out tomorrow's show because we'll be back and we're going to be talking about All-Americans. I'm just going to leave it at that.
And a little buy, sell,
of course,
hold.
Buy, sell, hold every Wednesday. But this coming tomorrow, we're going to talk All-Americans at first. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow afternoon. Tonight on the IB Nation Sports Talk, Ryan will be on to do a recruiting segment. There is a special guest that is also going to be on. And then, of course, Jesse and Sean will take you through rapid fire. And if you want to hear about Jesse's proposal, you're going to want to check out IB Nation Sports Talk. He finally popped the question. He finally decided to be an adult. So there you go. You can check that out as well. But for Brian, I'm Vince. We will talk to you tomorrow on IB Nation, Irish Breakdown Podcast. See, it's too many shows. I can't keep them straight.